A flight attendant tried to sew a black teen's lips shut with thread from the first aid kit, sneering, "Now you won't talk back." Seconds later, the CEO made sure the attendant's eyes would never open again. What happens next will leave you speechless. He held a needle and thread to a baby's lips, sneering that silence was the answer. Subscribe if you believe no uniform is above the law. The door alarm chirped, the jet bridge trembled, and the lead attendant's hand cut through the air in a brisk, ushering motion. "Sir, stroller folds here. Keep the aisle clear." Mason Dre didn't raise his voice, but his jaw flexed as if each word had to be forced past clenched teeth. Adrian Cross paused mid-step, balanced Elias against his chest, and clicked the stroller hinge with practiced calm. The baby shifted with a soft breath and pressed his cheek into Adrian's suit. Adrian nodded once, polite, contained, then slid the stroller to the side and stepped past the threshold into Flight 717. "Window or aisle?" Mason asked a passenger behind him without turning, eyes lingering on Adrian a second too long. It wasn't a glance of routine safety. It was a measurement, an inventory, a quiet counting of faults and privileges. Adrian felt it land the way a draft slips through a door, almost nothing, yet distinctly cold. The cabin buzzed with the ordinary. Bins thumped shut. Seatbelts clicked. A low murmur of greetings moved up the aisle like a tide. Adrian took 3A, a bulkhead seat he'd chosen for the extra space to keep Elias comfortable. He set a small tote under the seat, diapers, a swaddle, a slim folder with contracts he had reviewed on the drive to the airport. He didn't open the folder now. His task had changed. His objective, however, had not. Reach Ironvale City and close the deal that would lock Cadenza Systems into a decade of growth. He kissed the top of Elias's head and rocked him gently, feeling the tiny rise and fall that could erase the noise of any room. A tall man from row 4 leaned forward, smiling. "Need a hand with the overhead?" "I'm okay, thanks," Adrian said, tone steady, grateful for the small kindness. The man nodded and sat back. Mason swept down the aisle again, posture rigid, walk precise. He adjusted a vent, straightened a safety card, tugged a buckle with a short, sharp motion. When he reached 3A, he stopped. "If you need anything," he said, the smile never reaching his eyes, "use the call button." "We prefer to manage requests in order." Adrian met the gaze without heat. "Understood." Elias stirred. Adrian shifted him to a more secure cradle and brushed a thumb over the boy's tiny ear. The plane's door thumped shut. A second attendant, broad-shouldered, quiet, locked it with a heavy lever. The intercom crackled to life with the flight deck's calm voice, and the cabin slid into that held-breath quiet that always arrived between the safety demonstration and the pushback. Mason's announcement was flawless, words practiced into muscle memory, but his timing felt like a metronome struck too hard. "We ask all passengers to comply with crew instructions." His eyes traced the rows, stopping again on Adrian as if to pin the sentence to a body. Adrian smoothed a corner of the swaddle. He told himself to release the comment, to let the tone dissolve into the white noise of engines. He had made a career of ignoring unhelpful signals and answering only what mattered. Yet something in the precision of Mason's stare caught, a burr under cloth. The aircraft eased backward. A tremor ran through the floor as the tug detached. Adrian breathed in the sharp, clean scent of the recirculated air and counted a slow rhythm in his head, matching it to Elias's breaths. His mind sketched the first minutes after landing. Car at Ironcrest, route to the tower, handshake with the board chair, Clause B rephrased to protect equity. It all clicked through like gears. Beneath the gears moved a different set of thoughts. Softer, older, watch the temperature, shield the light, listen first, then act. Mason reappeared and crouched by the bulkhead jump seat to fasten his harness for takeoff. His knee brushed the metal post, and the small sound was sharper than it needed to be. He glanced up at Adrian again, a quick cut of the eyes. "First time flying with an infant?" Mason asked. It was a question that could have been helpful if not for the thin wire of judgment coiled behind it. "No," Adrian said, and left it there. "Right." Mason gave a brief, tight smile and looked away. The cabin lights softened. Engines surged. The runway stripes snapped past in clean white dashes, and the pressure pressed Adrian into his seat. Elias let out a small cry that trembled between fear and surprise. Adrian cupped the back of his son's head and bent close, voice quiet. "It's all right. Just the climb." The wheels left the earth. Buildings fell back into patterns. The river turned to a ribbon of light. Elias's cry steadied into a whimper and then eased, his fingers curling around the edge of Adrian's tie. A narrow laugh from somewhere behind, just a man reacting to liftoff, thrilled, skated the edge of irritation but didn't catch. The ascent smoothed. The wing shivered and then settled, a single exhale across metal and sky. When the seatbelt sign chimed off, Mason stood immediately. He pulled free of the jump seat with a crisp click and stepped into the aisle. A passenger in 3C leaned across with an apologetic smile. "Could I get a bottle of water?" "In a moment," Mason said, already looking past him. His gaze returned to Adrian and paused. "If there are special needs, inform us early. We can't cater to situations that escalate." Adrian looked at him, measured the words, and chose quiet. "Thank you for letting me know." Mason blinked at the polite response, then stepped toward the galley with a small shake of the head. The second attendant moved behind him, avoiding eye contact, moving with that careful speed of someone who knows the rhythm but not the melody. A few rows back, two men debated a game score in low voices. Across the aisle, a young man in a gray hoodie tapped a message on his phone, holding it low. The screen's glow flicked up across his face and reflected in the window, twin sparks in the glass. He glanced toward 3A, curious but contained, then dropped his gaze as if deciding to be a witness rather than a participant. Adrian freed a hand and pulled a small pre-measured bottle from the tote. He glanced toward the galley. He could ask for help, but he didn't like throwing needs into waters that held rough currents. Instead, he checked the time, doing the math of feed schedules against flight duration. He wasn't in a rush. He wasn't going to be pushed to extremes by anybody's impatience. Mason returned with the water for 3C, set it down without meeting the man's eyes, then paused again at Adrian's row. "We'll do service when the flight deck clears us," he said. The line was standard. The tone added something it didn't need. "Understood," Adrian said again, and adjusted Elias's blanket. He could feel the other man searching for a misstep to anchor his authority. He could also feel his own patience like a muscle being trained, steady, flexible, and stronger than it used to be. The plane cut through a narrow bank of thin cloud, and the cabin dimmed to pewter before the sun burned through. In that brief shadow, Mason's face was all planes and angles, a sculpture of control with a hairline crack no one would see if they weren't looking straight at it. The intercom popped. "Good afternoon from the flight deck," the captain said, warm and direct. "We're leveling at 32,000. Smooth air ahead for a while. We appreciate your cooperation. Adrian tasted the word, neutral but heavy. He rocked Elias and watched the baby's eyes follow a slant of light on the ceiling. He kept his own voice low and steady. "Easy, little man." A narrow obstacle arrived with no noise at all. Mason stepped back from a row farther up, then stopped at the bulkhead and placed his palm on the wall as if feeling for a heartbeat. He turned and spoke to the second attendant in a tone too soft to carry. The second nodded and moved away. It wasn't dramatic, but it was deliberate. Mason approached 3A once more, the distance between them measured in steps and in a history Adrian could not know. "A reminder," Mason said. "Keep your movements minimal during service. The aisle is narrow." "I know," Adrian said. "Calm, even." He kept his eyes on Mason's, not challenging, not bending. Mason's gaze dropped to Elias and stayed there a beat too long. The baby's hands opened and closed, unaware of the scrutiny. Adrian felt his shoulders square. He had sat across from boards and banks, had endured jokes meant to bruise and questions built to trap. He had walked out of rooms with deals that were supposed to be impossible because he could hold the line between reaction and response. That skill was not a shield. It was a tool. He adjusted his grip on Elias, making a small shelter out of an arm and a chest. The trolley rattled from the galley, the sound clicking against the aisle floor at a steady tempo. Mason didn't move to take it. He stood, eyes flat as if confirming an internal rule that had been written before any of them had boarded. Then, with abrupt efficiency, he stepped aside and let the second attendant guide the cart around him. Only then did he offer a brittle smile at a passenger who didn't need it. The cart squeaked on past, leaving contrails of coffee and plastic and polished chrome. Mason followed, and the quiet behind him seemed to echo. The man in 4D leaned toward the window and watched clouds shear by as if reading a script. The young man in the gray hoodie stole a glance toward 3A again, then reflexively tilted his phone toward his lap, camera icon hovering at the edge of his thumb. He didn't tap it. Not yet. Adrian let out a slow breath. He wasn't going to invent trouble where there was only posture. He also wasn't going to pretend he hadn't seen the warning embedded in that posture. He was here for a meeting that would change the arc of his company. He was here as a father before he was anything else. The plane hummed with that steady, living sound that makes conversation softer and thoughts clearer. Somewhere forward, a latch clicked. Somewhere aft, a child, not his, laughed once and then fell quiet, silenced by a parent's gentle hand. The light shifted warmer. Mason's voice drifted back from the galley, something measured to someone who agreed too quickly. When he returned again, he didn't speak. He passed 3A with a straight back and a face that gave away nothing at all. Yet even in the practiced stillness, a pulse of resentment moved like heat across asphalt. Adrian felt it and filed it. He protected the quiet between his son's breaths, guarded it like a perimeter. The world, for a moment, held steady. The ceiling lights glowed. The belts lay flat. The sky outside was a clean sheet folded edge to edge. Adrian tipped his head the smallest degree and registered the simple facts. A man in a uniform who wore control-like armor, a cabin full of strangers choosing not to see the thin line of disdain, and a father whose patience would be mistaken for softness by someone eager to prove a point. He did not argue with any of it. He made a decision instead, the same kind he made in conference rooms when stakes were high and next moves mattered. He would watch. He would measure. He would act only when action was needed, and when it came, he would not hesitate. Mason brushed past once more, shoulder almost grazing the aisle seat, eyes flicking to Elias as if to test a boundary only he could see. The smile returned, practiced and empty. The temperature in the space between them dropped a degree no thermometer could show. Adrian held his son tighter and turned his face toward the window, toward the clean horizon cut by the wing. In the glass he could see the reflection of Mason's profile, sharp as a blade and just as quiet. He marked it and let the reflection fade, the decision already set in him. He knew what stillness before a storm felt like. He had walked into too many rooms where it lived. The engine note softened and leveled. The captain's voice returned, a simple check-in and a promise of smooth air ahead. The words moved across the rows and evaporated. What didn't evaporate was the look Mason left behind when he passed, the kind that says nothing and yet announces itself as a challenge. Adrian didn't answer the challenge. He adjusted the swaddle. He lowered his chin. He kept the rhythm. He chose calm with the same intention other men choose force. The result was the same, a line drawn. Outside, the sky stayed bright and clean. Inside, the cabin learned a new kind of quiet, the kind that makes men sit taller without knowing why. Somewhere behind, a gray-hooded passenger finally slid his thumb over the camera icon and then, reconsidering, dimmed the screen. He didn't know why, only that a story was beginning. Mason continued forward, shoulders squared, steps exact, and never once looked back. He didn't have to. He had set something in motion with nothing more than tone and time. Everyone else felt it without knowing its name. Sometimes the quietest moments carry the sharpest warnings. Mason set the paper cup on the tray table with a practiced flick, and a thin wisp of cold, steamless air rose from its surface. "Warm water?" Adrian had asked, voice low so as not to startle the baby nestled in the crook of his arm. The cup was unmistakably chilled. Condensation clung to the sides, beating into clear droplets that slid toward Mason's gloved knuckles. Adrian stared at it for a beat, then lifted his eyes. "I asked for warm," he said evenly, careful to keep calm in his tone. His son, Elias, shifted and let out a small, restless sound, his cheeks puffed from recent crying and his eyelids fluttering with the sticky weight of sleep that would not come. Mason offered a thin smile that never reached his eyes. Up close, the corners of his mouth looked carved, not softened by sincerity. "Cabin supply is limited," he replied, shoulders squared, posture almost ceremonial. "This is what we have." Across the aisle, a man in a gray jacket glanced over his magazine and then back down, uncertain whether to be involved. Another passenger, broad-shouldered, close-cropped hair, adjusted his headset but left it around his neck, listening without seeming to. Adrian let out a slow breath, the way one releases tension at the top of a long exhale. "I can mix it," he said, not wanting to escalate. It helps if it's warm." He lifted the cup a fraction, feeling the chill nip at his fingers. He could improvise, a little cold water first, then wait, then test a droplet on his wrist. The process was familiar, the patience required, even more so. Mason's gaze did not shift from the child. It stayed fixed, unwavering, as if the baby were an unwelcome variable on a flight chart. "Some people," Mason murmured, not quite under his breath, "just aren't fit to travel with infants." The sentence hovered like a contrail, thin but staining the air. Elias gave a short, high wail, the kind that turns heads not for volume, but for the pitch that hints at need. Adrian rocked him gently, tapping the cup against the tray to steady his own hands. "We all paid for our seats," he said, voice still measured, "and he has the same right to be here as anyone." Mason's smirk deepened a notch, the uniform's crisp lines giving his face a fortified frame. "Rights come with responsibilities," he said, "like not disturbing everyone in the cabin." The man in the gray jacket shifted again. He wasn't the only one. The close-cropped passenger leaned forward slightly, elbows on knees, eyes flicking from Mason to the child. The overhead lights hummed, and the soft thrum of engines laid a steady bass note beneath everything, a reminder that miles of air separated them from land and that every small decision mattered at altitude. Adrian dragged the tray closer and, with care that felt ceremonial, twisted the cap from the formula bottle. He measured, stirred, and swirled, testing a drop against the inside of his wrist, his expression disciplined. The water was too cold. He tried again, rubbing the bottle gently between his palms to coax a little warmth, a father's workaround in a system that didn't care. Elias's cry rose and fell, not constant, but insistent, and the sound threaded through the cabin like a violin string tuned a half-step too tight. "Sir," Mason said, the word polished to sound helpful, the tone anything but, "perhaps you could take him to the galley. Fewer people to disturb there." Adrian looked up. "I'll comfort him here," he said. "He'll settle." He turned his shoulder to create a small wall, a private corner in public space, and tucked Elias closer. The baby's skin was warm and damp against his wrist. He smelled faintly of cotton and milk. Mason didn't move. He stood with the stance of someone trained to occupy a space until the other person yielded. "Passengers have complained," he said. Adrian's brows lifted just a millimeter. "Already?" Mason's eye flicked to the call panel as if there were lights to prove it. "They don't always push buttons," he replied, the hint of triumph touching the corners of his mouth again. "They expect us to handle it." Adrian glanced to the aisle. The gray-jacketed man kept his eyes down but shifted once more. The close-cropped listener offered the faintest of nods when Adrian's gaze brushed him, a quiet acknowledgement that did not announce itself as support but felt like it. Dramatic irony folded itself into the moment. The cabin's silent witnesses understood more than either man wanted to admit aloud. "I'm handling my son," Adrian said, and his voice held a firmness that couldn't be mistaken. "He's frightened. He's tired. He has the right to cry, and I have the right to comfort him." Mason's jaw flexed, a small muscle hopping near his cheekbone. "You have the right to be considerate," he said. "Everyone has meetings. Everyone has nerves. Your child is not the only person on this flight." "Of course," Adrian answered. He drew in a breath and added, "which is why I asked for warm water." A simple request. A beat passed, 1, 2, and a tremor of turbulence ticked the wing, enough to make the overhead compartments click, enough to make the aisle lights blink, then steady. Mason's hand tightened on the top of the seat. He had found his footing again before the plane did. "I will see what I can do," he said, the last word dropping as if it were a coin tossed without care. He leaned in half an inch, his breath even, controlled. "But if you can't keep him quiet, you may need to walk him in back. The captain prefers a calm cabin. The captain. The unseen authority." Mason wore the hint like a badge. Adrian's face did not change. Years of negotiation had taught him that the first person to raise his voice was often the first person to lose. "I'll do what is needed for him," he said simply. Mason pivoted smoothly, the way a door closes when oiled well. As he stepped past the close-cropped passenger, the man's knee shifted outward just enough that Mason had to pause a fraction. The pause said nothing and everything. Mason's eyes slid to the knee, then to the man's face, then forward again, a note of irritation tightening his stride. Adrian bent to Elias, angling the bottle and letting a drop rest against the baby's lower lip. The crying paused as curiosity won a small battle. A soft, tentative suck. Relief skimmed Adrian's spine. "That's it," he whispered, rocking in a slow, sea-wise rhythm. "That's it, buddy. The plane leveled again, the engine's pitch settling into a calmer hum. Across the aisle, the gray-jacketed man lifted his eyes once more. "He'll be okay," he said in a low voice, careful not to invite Mason back. "Takes a minute sometimes." "Thank you," Adrian murmured. He didn't know the man, but the thread of empathy pulled taut between them for a second. He felt its strength. A few rows back, a cough, and then the turn of a page. The world of the cabin tried to resume, tried to drape a thin blanket over what had just passed, but the blanket didn't fit. The edges left skin exposed. Mason returned sooner than expected, empty-handed this time, as if the point was not service, but presence. He halted at the row and leaned a knuckle against the headrest, posture immaculate, expression arranged. "Any improvement?" he asked, as if logging the noise level in a report. "Some," Adrian said. Elias's eyes had softened, but tension still sawed through his small chest. Up, down, a little too fast. Mason lowered his voice into something that might have sounded kind to anyone not looking. "You know," he said, "there are times to travel with infants and times to— wait." He let the final word hang, an ellipsis made human. "Consider the comfort of others." It wasn't a suggestion. It was a reproof wrapped as advice. Adrian felt heat brush his neck, not anger exactly, but a quick flare of alertness. The difference mattered. Anger shortens the field of view. Alertness widens it. "He's not a machine I can switch off," Adrian replied, matching the softness but not the message. "He's a person. A very small one. I will do everything I can for him, and I will do it here." The close-cropped passenger straightened, then relaxed again, as if rethinking the moment he had been about to enter. In the next row, a boy in a baseball cap— no, a young man, early 20s, tucked his phone away and stared out the window, where cloud banks stacked like mountain ridges, pale and endless. He exhaled slowly, as if checking his pace. Mason's eyes thinned. The cabin lights cast a hard edge on his features, sharpening what might otherwise have blurred. "We can move you," he said. "There may be a seat near the back, less traffic." A beat. "Fewer ears." Adrian held the flight attendant's gaze. "We're fine here," he said. He lifted the bottle again, tipped a little more. Elias latched and drew another short swallow. It was not much, but it was something, and in a pressurized tube 30,000 feet up, small victories counted as large ones. Silence pooled. The moment could have passed. It almost did. Then Elias's face crumpled again, sudden and complete, and the cry returned, sharper this time, edged with need. Adrian winced only inwardly. He adjusted, changed arms, tucked the baby's feet into his palm, pressed his cheek against soft hair. "I know," he whispered. "I know." Mason's jaw hardened, and his gaze flitted to the gray-jacketed man, to the close-cropped listener, to the young man in the cap, reading the room like a weather chart. He seemed to draw confidence from the noise more than from any rulebook. "Sir," he said, a bright professional note varnished over something brittle, "you're creating a disturbance." Adrian lifted his eyebrows and his voice cooled by a single degree. "My son is crying," he said. "That is not the same as a disturbance." "Tell that to the rest of the cabin," Mason answered, and this time he did not lower his voice. Heads turned because a raised voice is its own invitation. The attention satisfied him. It showed in the set of his shoulders. The close-cropped passenger stood, slowly, deliberately. He didn't speak. He reached for the overhead bin as if adjusting a bag, then sat again. The gesture said, "Present." The message, silent but sturdy, pressed against the air between men. Adrian's mind ticked through options. Accept the back of plain exile and give Mason the stage? Refuse and risk the attendant making the moment larger? Call the captain and turn courtesy into conflict? He felt the pressure of decision and placed it not on Mason, but on time. "Please bring the warm water when you can," he said. "I'll keep trying." Mason's smile did not move. "I'll see," he said, and then he did what he had done before. He lingered. Not long, just long enough that it felt like a test. When he left, it was with a final glance at Elias, too long for simple concern, too cold for anything resembling care. The gray-jacketed man turned his magazine page the wrong direction, realized it, and turned it back. "People forget they were babies once," he said quietly, not as an ally's speech but as an observation, like calling the color of the sky. Adrian nodded without looking up, because to look up was to invite the moment to be about something larger than the baby's need. He refused that invitation. His world narrowed to warmth, rhythm, breath. He tapped the bottle again, he changed angles, he counted his own breaths, sinking his calm to the rise and fall of the small chest against him. A minute stretched. Another. Somewhere forward, the seatbelt sign pinged off, then on again, an absent-minded metronome. Elias took a longer pull. A good one, then another. For 2 long breaths, quiet. A tiny hiccup. Adrian felt his shoulders loosen by a thread. He kissed the baby's crown, whispered praise, a father's litany that needs no audience to be true. The reprieve fractured when a cart clinked in the aisle, metal on metal, a sound small but sharp. Elias flinched, the bottle slipped a fraction, and the cry came back with renewed force, the kind that seems to echo not from throat but from ribs. The close-cropped passenger closed his eyes and opened them again, calm, as if bracing for a wave that would break either way. Mason did not push the cart himself. He passed behind it, eyes scanning, and stopped again at the row. He didn't speak at first. He simply watched. Then, to Adrian, evenly, "We'll be making cabin checks." "Please be considerate," he added, as if confiding a truth that bound them. "Noise carries farther than you think." Adrian felt a tightening at the base of his skull, the warning that usually made him step back from a deal before it soured. He swallowed it. Not here. Not with Elias's soft hair against his chin. "I understand," he said. "I'm doing all I can." "And yet," Mason murmured, the 2 words attaching themselves to the space like hooks. The young man in the baseball cap glanced over, then down at his shoes, then up again. His lips parted, then closed. He seemed to sense the line between observer and participant and hover on it, a foot over possible. Adrian rocked and hummed a low note, almost inaudible under the engine's steady purr. The note was not for the attendant or the cabin. It was for the boy in his arms and for the man holding him, 2 hearts negotiating peace at altitude. The humming gathered a shade of steadiness into the small space they occupied. Mason broke the fragile frame of calm with a final sentence spoken with official brightness that sounded, somehow, like a threat dressed as a promise. "We'll be monitoring," he said. Then he walked on, each step precise, the neat hinge of a door closing down a hallway. Adrian watched him go and, for the first time since takeoff, allowed himself to imagine the slope of the next hour, the hour after that, the landing. He saw decisions like check marks on a list he hadn't chosen to write. He thought of his son's right to be small and frightened and loud and loved, and of his own duty to make room for that right, even in places that tried to narrow it. He considered the man's lingering glance and the way it had felt less like a look and more like a mark, a place pinned on a map for later return. Elias's cry thinned to a whimper and then to a quiet, hiccuping sigh. The world did not turn soft, but it did, for a moment, stop scraping. Adrian pressed his cheek to the boy's head and let his eyelids lower for a single breath. Not sleep, not even rest, but a pause, a held note. A voice from 2 rows behind, another man, surprised into saying it out loud, "He's calming." The voice carried just enough hope to make itself a bridge. "Yes," Adrian said, eyes still shut. "He is." The engine's thrum continued, steadier now, as if the plane itself approved the partial peace. The cart rattled on. Pages turned. A zipper snicked open. Nothing was fixed, but some things were held together by will and patience and a father's stubborn quiet. Without warning, the intercom clicked, a soft, mechanical throat clear, and then went silent again, as if someone had pressed the wrong button and released it. The small sound shouldn't have meant anything, but it felt like a finger grazing a bruise. Adrian opened his eyes. He didn't look for Mason. He didn't need to. He could feel the shape of the attendant's attention the way one senses a glare, even with a closed door between. Foreshadowing does not announce itself. It hums, waiting. Adrian shifted his grip, anchored his feet, and made the choice to stay exactly where he was, to rock and breathe and be a wall his son could lean against. Whatever came next, he would meet it as he met this. Steady, watchful, present. Elias inhaled, exhaled, inhaled, then offered a small tired sound that said truce for now. The cabin settled around that truce, an agreement as fragile as glass. Adrian did not look away from his son, but in the corner of his eye he saw the shadow of a uniform pause at the far end of the aisle, held for a heartbeat, then move on. He didn't know, could not know, what the next minutes would shape, but he understood the map of this moment, and the pressure lines etched into it by a man whose smile didn't reach his eyes. The temperature of the cup on the tray cooled further, tiny droplets sliding down in parallel lines clean as ruled paper. The uneasy calm held, stretched, and vibrated with tension no one named but everyone felt. Adrian pressed his palm to the bottle, warming it with his skin, and the baby's mouth found it again, drawing with new, uncertain purpose. The engine hummed. The lights hummed. The cabin hummed with a quiet that was not peace but a contract awaiting signatures. Somewhere behind him, a latch clicked. Somewhere ahead, a step slowed. The space between those two sounds felt like the narrowest bridge in the world. The louder the cries, the sharper the knives of resentment became. Mason's hand hovered with an eerie steadiness, the curved suture glinting under the cabin lights as if it belonged to an operating room and not an aisle at 30,000 feet. Adrian did not breathe, could not, his body jolting forward before his mind could assemble the danger into words. Elias's small face tightened, a tremor of confusion crossing his brow a split second before pain found him. The infant's cry fractured the hush, high and raw, the sound ricocheting off plastic panels and polished windows. "Stop," Adrian said, his voice low but edged like glass. His right hand shot out, catching Mason's wrist. The attendant's skin was cold, tendons taut as cable. For a heartbeat they were locked, two men meeting in the narrow space between a seatback and the aisle, gravity tilted by the simplest of objects, thread and steel. Mason did not blink. "If he can't cry," he murmured, each word measured, "then no one will be disturbed." His tone held no heat. That made it worse. It sounded like a rule learned long ago and never questioned. His jaw set, and with a controlled twist he freed his wrist from Adrian's grip. The needle pricked, not deep, but enough to raise a bead of red that brightened like a warning light against Elias's soft skin. The men nearby flinched in unison. A man in 14C pushed his glasses up with shaking fingers. Another man across the aisle half rose, then froze, eyes flicking to the lit, fasten seatbelt sign as if it were an iron law he could not cross. Someone whispered, "Is this a medical thing?" Hope clinging to the word medical like a life vest. It wasn't. Adrian's mind surged through possibilities and slammed into a wall of disbelief. Then training took over, the quiet drills of fatherhood, the sharper drills of leadership. Assess the threat. Secure the vulnerable. Neutralize with minimum risk. He shifted his body sideways, angling his shoulder between Mason and the child, his left arm cradling Elias close, his right hand open and ready. His pulse thudded in his neck, loud as a drum. "Mason," Adrian said, using the man's name as a stake in the ground, "you will hand me the needle." Now he kept his voice even, not pleading, not angry, a command wrapped in calm. He was dimly aware of the cabin smell, recycled air, metal, citrus from a spilled drink, that ordinary mix that made what he was seeing feel even more unordinary. Mason crouched lower, the first aid kit open at his knee like a tidy box of accidents waiting to happen. His posture was careful, contained. "You are not in control here," he replied, the words almost gentle. "I am." His eyes did not touch Adrian. They studied Elias as if measuring sound against thread. The needle in his fingers dipped again, testing the space Adrian protected. "Don't," said a man 2 rows back, his voice cracking. He clutched the armrests like a brace. "Please, don't." For a second, Adrian saw it all from above, the gray runner of carpet, the grid of blue seats, a ring of men holding their breath while a single decision cut the air. He felt the familiar pull of 2 roads, de-escalation and force. De-escalation had seconds left. He gave it 1. "Listen to me," Adrian said, leaning in so his words could not miss. "He's a baby. He is doing what babies do. Give me the needle. We will help you step away, and no one will be hurt." He let the word help land with weight, an offered bridge. Mason's mouth curved into something that was not quite a smile. "Help," he echoed softly. His gaze lifted at last. Up close his pupils were pinpoints, his calm scraped thin. "I am helping everyone." The thread tugged through his gloved fingers with a whispering sound, a sound too clean for what it meant. Adrian moved. His right hand snapped forward, aiming for Mason's thumb, the hinge of control, while his left forearm shielded Elias's face. Mason's response was unsettlingly fast. He rotated his wrist and pirouetted the needle's arc downward, not striking but threatening, the point a hair's breadth from skin. The movement was trained, not random. A rule learned, a technique practiced. Adrian filed that away even as he pressed closer, owning the space. Elias wailed again. The cry sliced straight through Adrian's ribs, an alarm that turned thought into force. He hooked Mason's wrist and shoved it down against the armrest, pinning it with a weight that was all promise. This ends now. The needle bit into the vinyl, bending. Mason hissed, the first sound that held heat. "Hand it over," Adrian said. He was conscious of his breath, the count of it, as if the number itself could hold him steady. He imagined taking the needle, placing it in the kit, closing the lid. He imagined clicking the call button and saying the right procedural words. He imagined the plane leveling back into a world where nothing like this had happened. He held that image like a lighthouse. Mason's free hand flicked to the kit. He palmed the spool of thread, a pale circle against his glove. His eyes sharpened. "You still don't understand," he said almost tenderly. "Order must be kept." The thread became a living thing. He looped it over Adrian's forearm and pulled, not to bind but to distract. Adrian's muscles answered with instinct. He adjusted, shifted weight, and in that fractional looseness Mason twisted, slipping his pinned wrist sideways. The needle sprang back into play and the arc of it found Elias's lip again. A thin, dreadful line opened, a brief, bright hinge of red, and then the needle was away as Adrian slammed Mason's hand down once more. The men around them jolted. The man in 14C swore under his breath, then clamped a hand over his mouth as if the syllable itself had broken a taboo. Another man fumbled his phone up, thumb shaking over the camera. He whispered to the boy beside him, also male, eyes wide, "Record. Don't move. Record." The lens caught the gleam of steel, the spill of the kit, Mason's set jaw, Adrian's braced stance, Elias's tiny fist clutching at his father's shirt. Adrian's thoughts tightened into a line of action. Create separation, disarm, contain. He eased 2 inches back, bringing Elias closer into his chest, feeling the boy's shuddering sobs against his sternum. The weight of his son was a vow. He angled his body to block any straight line from needle to skin. He noted the exits, the aisle forward, the aisle back, the narrow slot to the window. Limited, but there. "Stand down," Adrian said. The words were flat now, iron laid on the table. "This ends." Mason's breathing changed, a fraction quicker. He rolled his shoulders, tiny adjustments that looked like calm to the casual eye but spoke to Adrian of gathering energy. "You think title matters here," Mason said. "It doesn't. Only rules." The way he said "rules" made it sound like a story told to a much younger man, one who had believed it so hard it calcified. "This noise," he added, chin tipping toward Elias, "is harm." "No," Adrian said, and he let the truth enter his voice like a charge. "This needle is." The 2 men held in a pause so taut it felt like the cabin itself drew in breath. The plane's gentle shudder through high air became suddenly loud, the engines a low, steady growl. Far forward, a chime sounded, a routine alert, meaningless here, and lights blinked amber across the galley, painting Mason's profile with a warning he did not read. Foreshadowing threaded itself through the moment. The phone lens, the men's reluctance hardening into resolve, the way Mason's calm kept fraying at the edges. Adrian felt the shape of the next minutes without seeing the details. Either the needle would be surrendered, or force would crack the stalemate wide open. There was no third path left. A man across the aisle, broad-shouldered, face pale, rose to one knee and then to both feet, bracing himself against the overhead bin. "I'm here," he said to Adrian, quiet and sure. "Say it, and I move." His name would come later. Now he was simply a line of support. Another man behind Adrian leaned forward, his hand hovering over the call button as if it were a talisman. Courage was gathering, shy at first, then more certain. Mason noticed. His eyes flicked to the rising shapes, then back to the needle, then to Adrian. "You see," he said, an odd softness in his voice as if relieved to be proven right. "Chaos multiplies." Adrian shifted his stance, a fighter's triangle. "The only chaos," he said, "is you." The decision fell like a coin. Mason lunged. Adrian met him. He did not pull away, he stepped in, closing distance before the needle could build speed. His forearm snapped up in a hard parry, knocking Mason's wrist sideways. Metal kissed plastic, skittered. The needle's tip sliced a shallow scratch across Adrian's sleeve and grazed the skin beneath. A bright sting, nothing more, and then Adrian's hand clamped down on Mason's forearm. The grip absolute. Elias cried, then hiccuped, then cried again. Each sound landed like a hammer on Adrian's ribcage, forging something tempered and unbreakable. He drove Mason's hand down and planted it on the armrest, elbow locked, wrist pinned. With his other hand he scooped the needle, near the hub, and twisted it free. The tiny instrument felt absurdly light in his fingers, like holding a dangerous idea. For a split second, Mason's face went naked. Surprise? Yes, but also a flash of something like grief, as if the rule he'd clutched had been torn from him and left a space he could not fill. It hardened into anger in the next breath. His free hand slapped to the kit, closing around the thread again. That pale loop that had started this. Adrian saw it and recognized a truth that chilled him. The needle was only one edge. The thread itself was a weapon in the wrong hands. He slid the needle out of reach, tucking it to the far corner of the open kit with a smooth, practiced motion, even as he held Mason pinned. He kept his voice calm for the men watching, for the child he held, for himself. "It's over," he said, steady and final. But Mason was not listening. He drew the thread through his fingers, the spool humming faintly as it unrolled. The move was almost delicate. His hands learned at this, and that knowledge rang in Adrian like a bell. Learned at this. A procedure. A habit formed in shadows where no one had said no. The men in the nearest row leaned in. The broad-shouldered one set his stance wider, waiting for a cue. The boy with the phone did not lower it. The man with the glasses whispered, "Tell me when," to no one in particular, as though permission were a password they all needed to hear. Adrian met Mason's eyes and saw no randomness there. What lived behind them was colder than temper. It was conviction gone brittle. That was the true danger. It could not be argued with. It had to be stopped. "Put the thread down," Adrian said, the words quieter now because quieter could carry farther. Mason's lips moved. The words did not match the scene. They sounded like a recitation. "This is for everyone's comfort," he said. "This is necessary." The thread lifted like a line thrown across a gap. Adrian tightened his grip. His shoulder burned. He did not give it a voice. He thought of 3 steps ahead and kept them in sequence. Signal support, shift the child, finish the disarm. He angled his chin at the broad-shouldered man. "Now," he said, and that one syllable broke the spell. The man moved, not reckless, not wild, precise. His hands came down on Mason's other forearm, pinning the thread hand to the armrest too. Another passenger, older, jaw clenched, also male, reached out and closed the first aid kit with a decisive clap, the sound like a gavel. The phone kept recording. For the first time, a ripple of uncertainty crossed Mason's face. His eyes flicked from hand to hand, from thread to closed lid. His mouth opened, no words came. In that quiet, Adrian felt the plane again. The hum, the air, the shared space. It returned like a room after a storm, still tense, but claiming itself. "Look at me," Adrian said to Mason, because attention could interrupt compulsion. Mason did. "This," Adrian went on, each word slow, "ends. You are going to let go." A tremor ran through the thread. Mason's fingers loosened, fraction by fraction. The spool ticked twice, then stopped. Adrian exhaled, not all the air, just enough to make space for the next breath. He did not release the pin. He looked to the man with the phone and said, "Keep recording." He looked to the man with the glasses and said, "Press the call button now." He looked to the boy and said, "It's okay to be scared." He looked back to Mason and said nothing at all. Elias hiccuped again, a tiny sound that somehow felt like the loudest thing in the cabin. Adrian lowered his cheek to the child's hair, just for a second, the smallest contact, a promise reconfirmed. His mind sketched the path forward, notify the cockpit, secure the kit, ensure distance. The worst might be behind them, he wanted to believe, but the air still held a wire of tension, and somewhere under that calm he sensed a coil not yet spent. In the quiet that followed, a single thought rose, the only one honest enough to hold the moment's weight, and it arrived in his head as a sentence he would remember. A line of thread became the line between sanity and madness. Adrian shoved Mason back with a force he did not know he possessed, the heel of his palm striking squarely into the attendant's chest and sending him stumbling into the armrest. The first aid kit clattered against a seat leg, its contents juddering. Adrian folded the baby into his chest with one arm, cheek to Elias's soft hair, and felt the fast, frightened flutter of his son's breathing. Warmth wet his knuckles. He glanced down and saw the thin smear of blood along Elias's lip where the needle had grazed him. The sight tightened everything inside him into a single instinct. Protect. Hold. Do not yield. Sir, please," a man across the aisle stammered, half rising, then sitting again as if afraid the carpet itself might collapse beneath his shoes. Somewhere down the row, a call button chimed. Another chimed, and then another, until the cabin ceiling twinkled with tiny orange lights, a quiet storm of alarms against a hush that was not silent at all, breathing, gasping, the blind scrape of a seatbelt buckle against plastic, a cough from a tense throat. Mason straightened, a hand braced on the headrest, eyes sharp and hard. The curved suture needle hung between his fingers like a hooked moon. He tipped his head, his voice a low, brittle rasp. "You think power protects you?" "Not here." The sentence slotted into the space between them like another blade. Adrian's jaw clenched. He scanned to the left and right without turning his head, measuring the trapped geography of the row, the narrow aisle, the metal edges of folded tray tables, the wedge of carpet leading to the galley where two male co-attendants stood rooted, Rowan with his hand half lifted, Dale gripping the rail with the tense caution of a man clutching a cliff. Neither moved. Their eyes flicked from the needle to the baby and back again, as if searching for a rule in a manual that did not exist. Adrian set his back against the window and widened his stance without shifting his feet, becoming a wall that could do two things at once, shield and watch. His voice, when it came, was steady. "Put the kit down." Step away. Mason's lips tightened. He did not step away. His gaze skimmed over Adrian's suit, over the well-cut fabric, over the expensive watch that glinted at the edge of the cuff, and landed again on the baby whose breath hiccuped against Adrian's shirt. There was resentment in that gaze that went beyond a crying child and a difficult flight. It was older, a crusted thing built in layers. "You walk in here and expect the air to make room for you," Mason said, not loudly but with a rhythm that snapped like a ruler. "This is not your boardroom." Adrian heard the words, but he also heard what lay beneath them: history, grudges, some storyline in which he played the villain simply by existing. He did not answer the challenge to his status. He shifted his weight to keep his body between the needle and Elias, and he mapped the next choices with cool precision. He could try to slide into the aisle and create distance. He could try to pass the baby into the arms of someone trustworthy. He could try to end this swiftly. Every option opened into a risk. Hey, I'm recording," a young male voice whispered from the row behind, too loud to be truly a whisper. Adrian saw him in the reflection on the window, a teenager or maybe early 20s, hair pushed back, phone held upright in both hands. The phone's lens did not shake. The boy's knuckles were white, but he was steady, and the red dot glowed. "It's all on video," he added as though the camera were a shield. Dramatic irony settled over the row. The recording might save them later, might alter everything in rooms far from this pressurized cabin, but it could not stop the next 5 seconds. Mason's eyes flicked toward the boy and then away. The needle gleamed again, small and bright and capable of harm far larger than itself. Rowan took half a step forward. "Mason," he said, voice controlled, palms open, the way one might address a cornered dog. "Let's take a breath." Mason did not look at him. "Stay out of this," he said, the hand that held the thread tightening until the line went tense and straight, a quiet thread. He took one slow step closer, his shoulder brushing a headrest. "Give me the child. I will settle him." Adrian felt a calm arrive that was not quiet, but disciplined, a narrow corridor through which everything he was moved. Father, strategist, leader. He thought of doorways and locks, of small margins and strong hinges. He used the seat's rigid shell at his hip as a barricade and angled his elbow to make a ledge for Elias, freeing his other hand by inches without exposing the baby to the aisle. Elias's fist curled in his shirt, tiny and hot. "You're not touching him," Adrian said. He kept his voice at a reasonable volume, the way a person might speak to keep his own heartbeat slow. The words were not a plea. They were policy. The plane shivered with a thin tremor, the kind of ordinary ripple that would be nothing on another day. On this day, it fell like a signal. A man 2 rows forward ducked his head and muttered a prayer. A bottle rolled, ticking along the aisle until it bumped Mason's shoe and quivered there, caught in the shadow of his stance. Mason nudged it aside without looking down. "Sir," Dale tried again from the galley, "the captain has been notified." But his voice wavered, and even he seemed to hear what it meant. Help existed somewhere past sealed doors. Adrian's mind moved the way it did when he calculated a difficult decision under a deadline. He visualized 3 outcomes and the triggers each required. He noted the boy with the camera, an ally he had not chosen but now valued. He noted Rowan, hesitant, afraid, but present. He noted Mason's posture, a slight cant forward, the dominant foot leading, weight ready to drive. He knew what the next movement would be because every argument, every negotiation, every escalation he had diffused or survived taught him the same shape: pressure, resistance, break. Mason's lips twitched into something too thin to be a smile. "You are used to saying a thing and watching the world shift," he murmured, so quietly Adrian barely heard him over the hush of vents. "Watch this, then." He feinted with his left shoulder. The needle hand dipped. Adrian did not chase the feint. He slid his forearm outward in a compact motion to block, his wrist aligned to strike the forearm rather than the hand, the way a man who had learned to conserve energy in crowded rooms might move. Metal tapped bone with a small, sharp sound. The needle skittered, but did not fall. Elias let out a soft, wounded cry, and Adrian felt that cry through his ribs like a bell. "Back away," Adrian said again, each syllable anchored. He looked at the needle and then at Mason's face, and in that narrow glance he saw something else surface beneath the anger, a flicker of calculation. Mason was not just furious. He was choosing. He was weighing the audience of glowing phones, the 2 frozen co-attendants, the tight geometry of the aisle, the infant in the center of a conflict he had started. He was building a story in his head in which he was the one who restored order. Rowan shifted another inch. "Mason, we can explain this to the captain." "No," Mason snapped, the single syllable cutting. "You'll explain nothing." He took another step, bringing the bite of alcohol and antiseptic from the open kit with him, a scent that bent the mind toward clinics and careful hands, except the hands here were neither careful nor kind. "Give me the child." Adrian's thoughts surged through a sequence and settled on the only lever he had that might slow Mason without igniting him further. Time. He could make every second heavy. He could make each movement deliberate. He could control the pace and keep the needle away. "Listen to me," Adrian said, keeping his tone level. "Look at his lip. He is hurt. Let me wipe it. You can stand there and watch if that makes you feel in control. But you will not touch him." Mason's jaw clenched. A vein pulsed in his temple. The needle hovered a breath from the baby's cheek. From the row behind, the young man with the phone whispered again, "I've got you. I've got you," as if recording were a promise kept. Adrian used the pocket square from his jacket with one practiced motion, pressing it lightly to Elias's lip, and Elias quieted by a fraction, the whimper falling into damp, hitching breaths. The moment worked like a hinge. The needle did not advance. The cabin exhaled, but the reprieve did not last. Mason's eyes dropped to the stain blooming on white fabric and hardened. "See?" he said, as if the tiny smear proved his point. "Noise breeds more noise. Disorder multiplies. I will stop it." He drew in, the thread going taut again, his forearm lifting. Adrian pivoted his shoulder, making his own body the shield instead of the cloth, absorbing the angle of the threat. The male passenger across the aisle, the one who had half risen before, rose again with more courage now, hands lifted. "I can help," he said, voice shaking but present. "Sit down," Mason barked, and the man flinched back into his seat, palms open, a thin sheen on his forehead. Adrian gripped the armrest with his free hand and felt the solid weight of it ground him to the moment. He did not look for sympathy. He did not look for permission. He measured the tiny distances, needle to skin, wrist to wrist, knee to aisle, shoulder to window. He centered his breath. The baby's heartbeat ticked against his sternum. "That's enough," he said. For the first time, Mason hesitated. The flicker of calculation passed again. He glanced toward the galley, perhaps expecting a superior to step in and formalize his control. No one moved. The air hummed. The phones watched. The corridor of choices narrowed to a single step. Adrian felt the next moment gather itself like a wave. He adjusted his hold on Elias by a hair's width and dropped his center of gravity, ready to meet whatever came with something more than fear, with intention. He knew that the line Mason held was not just thread. It was a symbol he had chosen, a false right to bind what did not belong to him. And Adrian, who built things in the world and knew what it took to keep them standing, rejected the claim. Mason inhaled, drawing himself up for another advance, and the boy behind the camera whispered, almost to himself, "This is going to be important later." Adrian did not turn. He did not break the line of his body, which was now a barrier and a promise. He set his mind on the path that would carry him through the cost of this moment and the cost to come. He felt fear, yes, but beneath it ran something steadier, older, more reliable than fear. Resolve shaped by responsibility. Every stitch Mason threatened became another reason Adrian vowed to fight. The cabin descended into pandemonium. Mason lunged again, the thread stretched between his fingers and the curved needle flashing like a tiny hook in stormlight. Adrian did not hesitate. He slid Elias into Victor Hale's arms with a motion so careful it looked rehearsed, his hands lingering for half a heartbeat on the baby's blanket as if fastening a promise there. "Hold him tight," Adrian said, his voice steady but edged, the voice of a man whose patience had run out. Victor nodded, jaw clenched, shoulders squared, cradling the child against his chest as if bracing for a wave. Adrian turned and met Mason head-on. The aisle's narrowness forced them close, their breath mingled with the metallic tang of spilled soda and hot plastic from the overhead vents. Knuckles cracked against ribs, elbows scraped armrests. A service tray skittered beneath their shoes like a startled insect. Passengers cried out, male voices rising in confused pleas, while seatbelt signs glowed a warning red that no one could obey. "Back off!" a man shouted from row 12, though his hands stayed welded to the armrests. Another man near the bulkhead lifted a phone with shaking fingers, the lens trembling as if it, too, were afraid to look directly at what it recorded. Mason drove Adrian into the seatback, forearm across his throat, the needle poised for the eye. "See how fast quiet returns," Mason hissed, his lips peeled into a smile that held no humor. His eyes were bright and unfocused, like lamps with a frayed wire. Adrian felt the sting of metal graze his brow. The world narrowed, the soft weight that had just left his arms, Victor's quick intake of breath, the rhythmic click of the trolley wheels that hadn't been locked down. Beneath the chaos, a single thought anchored him. Survive, then shield. Adrian shifted his stance, not with wild panic but with calculation. He dropped his weight and twisted, shoulder wedging under Mason's elbow. The needle wobbled, the thread snagged on a jacket button and tugged taut. Adrian slammed Mason's wrist against the tray table hinge. Metal barked. The needle bounced once and rang against the carpet. A collective gasp rippled through the aisle, a sound like air leaving a tire. For an instant, balance seemed to return, but Mason's laughter, thin, high, and oddly delighted, cut through the noise. He staggered back a step, then surged forward again, grabbing for Adrian's lapel with one hand while the other pawed blindly at the floor for the fallen instrument. "You think that ends it?" Mason said, his voice carrying a trembling glee. His jaw worked as if chewing a memory he refused to swallow. "You think noise can rule this cabin?" Adrian responded with a sharp hook to the ribs, the kind thrown by a man who knew how to conserve motion. Pain burst across Mason's face. His smile faltered, then sharpened into something crueler. The overhead lights flickered. Somewhere behind, a male passenger fumbled with an oxygen mask long out of reach, more for comfort than for air. The engine's low roar pressed against the fuselage like a constant drumbeat, a reminder that their world, for now, was a sealed metal corridor hurtling over clouds. "Victor, center aisle," Adrian called without taking his eyes off Mason. He heard the shuffle of shoes and the soft tremor of the baby's cry moving away from the flashpoint. Victor's answer came tight and controlled. "I've got him." The assurance steadied Adrian, but only by a fraction. He had won inches, not safety. Mason lunged low, catching Adrian around the waist. They slammed into an armrest, the cracked leather pinched Adrian's side. Mason's breath was hot and sour with adrenaline. "Men like you buy rules," he whispered, not quite to Adrian, not quite to himself. "Up here, I write them." He clawed for the floor again, fingers splaying, searching. Adrian stomped down. pinning Mason's hand to the carpet. Mason snarled and twisted. "Looking for something?" Adrian asked, but his voice betrayed no triumph, only urgency and a gathering coldness. The aisle had become a narrow arena that allowed no retreat, only trade. Adrian felt the plane tilt a degree and correct. A subdued chime sounded from the galley as if the aircraft itself winced. A man in the forward row rose halfway in his seat, hands hovering, then sat again, crushed by the fear of touching the storm. Another voice, steady but firm, called, "I'm recording this," as though the announcement could anchor truth to the floor. Mason feinted right and slashed left with an open hand, catching Adrian across the cheek. The slap stung, more insult than injury, but it blurred Adrian's vision long enough for Mason to wrench free. He shoved Adrian back onto the armrest and leaned in nose to nose, sweat beading across his brow. "Give him back," he said, flicking a glance toward Victor and the baby. "Noise ends today." "No," Adrian said. He placed both palms against Mason's chest and pushed, not hard, but with precision, just enough to clear space and reclaim breath. He could feel his pulse in his hands. His thoughts sharpened at the edges. Learn his pattern. Break it. The needle was gone, but the man was worse than the tool. Mason bent, plucked at the carpet, and found not the needle but the thread itself. Thin, translucent, coiled like a whisper. He lifted it, looped it between both fists, and pulled it taut. The line quivered in the damp cabin air. An eerie calm slid over his face, the calm of a man who believed he had discovered a purer cruelty. "Silence is simple," he murmured. "It only takes pressure." He raised the thread as one might raise a garrote. Adrian's stomach chilled. He stepped in before the loop could close, catching Mason's forearm and turning, half a dance, half a throw, angling the man's momentum past him. The thread grazed Adrian's neck and burned like fishing line. He smelled the faint, sterile scent of the first aid kit, the promise of order perverted into threat. "Put it down," Adrian said, and his voice sounded unfamiliar, low, controlled, without a hint of plea. "You will not touch him. You will not touch anyone." Mason's eyes flicked toward the forward galley, calculating, leaping across possibilities like stones in a river. He did not put it down. Instead, he stepped backward, drawing Adrian with him, forcing a shift in the battlefield. The beverage cart stood unsecured near the bulkhead, its locked drawers rattling softly with bottled weight. The temptation of leverage hummed there, obvious and dangerous. Adrian registered it, then pushed the thought away. Not yet. He needed space to breathe, not more hazards. A male attendant, face ashen, frozen by fear and allegiance, hovered at the galley threshold and then retreated 2 steps, hands raised in a gesture of helplessness that looked like surrender. "Sir, please," he said to Adrian, voice thin. "Please stop." The plea landed on no one. The storm had selected its own language. Mason strained the thread until it sang, the line slicing a bare crescent through the air. He snapped it forward, aiming to loop it, to catch something soft and defenseless. Neck, wrist, memory. Adrian ducked and surged inside the arc, ramming his shoulder into Mason's sternum. They collided with the stuttering thud of bodies running out of room. The thread licked across Adrian's cheek, scoring a shallow line that flashed heat. The taste of copper rose on his tongue. From the rear, Victor's voice cut through, measured, encouraging, the tone of a man holding a crying child and refusing to yield to panic. "Adrian, I'm steady. Do what you need." The words settled like a hand on Adrian's back, pushing him forward. He grasped Mason's sleeve, dragged the man half a step, and forced him against the aisle seat. The buckle clicked beneath a knee. A water cup rolled and flattened with a wet sigh. "Look at them," Adrian said, nodding toward the rows of men watching with wide eyes. "They're not with you." He was not pleading for allies. He was stripping Mason of an illusion. Mason's gaze darted along the faces and found only shock, pity, anger, the quiet rebellion of witnesses. Something in that recognition curdled. Mason's grin returned, thin as the thread between his fists. "They don't matter," he said, breath fluttering. "Only the quiet matters." He jerked forward with sudden speed, eyes fixed not on Adrian but beyond him. Adrian pivoted, intercepting the move just in time. The motion aimed not to strike but to escape, to carve a path toward Victor and the child. The realization hit Adrian like a cold wave. Control the angle, he told himself. Cut the lane. Make the price too high. He hooked his foot behind Mason's ankle and pulled. The man buckled, then recovered with animal stubbornness, batting at Adrian's hand and sweeping the thread upward again. The motion left his wrist exposed. Adrian seized it, twisted, and drove it, hard, precise, into the rigid hinge of the nearest tray table. The impact jolted through both of them. The thread went slack. The spool flipped from Mason's palm, tumbled, and bounced under the seat. For a heartbeat, no one breathed. The line, that fragile promise of harm, uncoiled like shed skin and lay still. Adrian felt the tension shift in the cabin, a tremor through the rows as if the aircraft itself exhaled. The moment was fragile, a glass edge between outcomes. Then Mason laughed. It was not loud. It did not need to be. The laugh threaded the space like a hairline crack crossing a windshield, proof that pressure would continue until something gave. He straightened slowly, rubbing his wrist, eyes gleaming with a feverish light that did not know defeat. "You're quick," he said, voice soft and admiring in a way that made the words colder. He tilted his head as if studying a specimen. "Good. I prefer challenges." Adrian's chest rose and fell. Sweat stung the cut on his cheek. The aisle smelled of sugar and iron and recycled air. He locked his gaze on Mason's hands. Not empty hands, never empty. Hands that could make weapons out of thread and policy and fear. He counted the obstacles, the armrests, the unsecured cart, the distance to Victor, and felt the path of the next decision shape itself, not as rage now, but as strategy. The cabin had learned something in these seconds, and so had he. Tools could be taken, will could not. The engine hum deepened as the plane moved through a pocket of heavier air. Someone 2 rows back whispered a prayer under his breath. Another voice, steadier now, said, "We saw what he did," as if naming truth could protect it from being twisted. Adrian stepped forward, ready to force Mason's focus back onto him, to keep danger from traveling down the aisle like a spark. Mason's eyes flicked once toward the galley, then back to Adrian. That glance, quick, hungry, was a map. It warned of what the man would reach for next and where the next line would be drawn. The future hovered there like an unseen door at the end of a narrowing corridor. Adrian braced, shoulders set, feet aligned, a man past patience and entering purpose. Around them, the phones kept recording. Evidence gathered like frost on a window, thin but everywhere, waiting for the right light to reveal its pattern. Adrian did not look at the lenses. He did not look at the hands wringing together or the heads bent in silent pleas. He looked at Mason, at the trickle of blood drying along the man's forearm, at the tremor in the fingers that spoke of pain acknowledged and ignored. He recognized it with a strange, grim clarity. The fight was no longer about a needle on the floor. It was about the next object, the next rule, the next line someone would try to cross. He drew a breath and closed the remaining distance by an inch, enough to reclaim the center of the aisle, enough to make himself the only direction the storm could move. His voice, when it came, was low and sure. "You're finished," he said, not as a threat but as an observation about the shape of things. Mason's smile thinned but did not disappear. In the tight, humming silence that followed, the plane seemed to hover on a decision. The spool lay under the seat, glinting faintly. The phones watched. Victor held the child as if the very air might try to take him, and Mason, wrist throbbing and eyes alight, readied himself for whatever came next, his laugh echoing like a promise no one wanted. The thread had fallen, but the terror was only tightening. The metal tray whistled through the air and clipped Adrian's shoulder with a sharp, ringing crack, the impact jolting him sideways into an armrest as a passenger's cried out. He caught himself on the seat back, breath snatched from his lungs, and looked up to see Mason already recovering his footing, knees bent, shoulders hunched, eyes blazing with a feverish focus that had nothing to do with duty. Overhead, bins rattled with a fresh tremor as the plane bucked in light turbulence. The narrow aisle seemed to tilt, compressing the distance between predator and protector. "Stay back," Adrian warned, voice low but steady, one hand braced against the seat, the other open and ready. He could feel the hot throb budding beneath his jacket where the tray had struck, but pain sharpened his thinking rather than dulling it. 3 rows ahead, Victor rocked Elias against his chest, trying to hush the child's frightened whimpering. The sound, a thin, vulnerable ribbon, threaded through the din and drew Mason's attention like a magnet. "Warm water wasn't difficult," Mason said, his words barely above a hiss as he crouched to snatch up the fallen suture needle. His fingers trembled around the gleam of curved steel, yet his grip was practiced, almost ritual. It was the principle. He rose slowly, framing Adrian in the narrow corridor as if marking a target on a board. The cabin light flickered and steadied. An exit sign stuttered to life with a weak crimson glow, painting the edges of Mason's jaw. Nearby, passengers pressed back into their seats, some with hands lifted in pleading gestures, some with phones raised but shaking. No one stood. The cockpit door stayed sealed. A chime sounded and died, followed by the captain's even voice over the intercom advising everyone to remain seated due to turbulence. Protocol was an iron wall. They were alone. "You touch him again," Adrian said, louder now, eyes locked, "and you'll regret it forever." He drew a long breath, steadying the tremor in his ribs. He had negotiated hostile rooms where smiling men hid knives behind contracts. This was the same logic without the paper. Control the space, calculate the odds, protect the objective. He set his feet shoulder-width apart, the rubber tread of the aisle runner warm beneath his soles. He slanted his hips to narrow the target, left shoulder forward, right hand low and ready to intercept. "Elias is not your lesson to teach." "Children learn when they're shown boundaries," Mason replied, the needle catching a cold line of light as he rolled it across his knuckles like a coin. His gaze flicked to Victor and back, a hunter's triangulation. "You wealthy men think noise is a right, but there are rules up here. There is order." His last word thudded like a dropped stone. He advanced a half step, testing, while the plane swayed again, seatbelt signs chiming in sympathetic pulses. Somewhere at the back, a man called out for the pilot to intervene. No answer came. A woman, one of the attendants, lifted a hand toward Mason, then froze, knuckles pressed white to her mouth. Loyalty and fear stitched her still. Adrian moved first, not to attack but to redraw the line. He shifted one row closer, his shoulders squaring, forcing Mason to acknowledge him rather than the child. "Look at me," Adrian said, calmer than he felt. "You want control? Take it from the person who can give it back." His voice carried the cadence of boardrooms, the weight of decisions that moved hundreds of lives. He saw Mason's pupils narrow, saw the small flare of resentment at the idea of being challenged openly. "Good. Focus on me. Forget the infant. Forget the camera lens in the third row that was recording everything." "The future of spoiled men," Mason muttered, almost to himself, and the phrase unspooled an ugly thread through the cabin. He lifted the needle, wrist angled, measuring the distance to Adrian's face as if it were a seam to be marked. "The noise ends when someone has the courage to end it." "Courage isn't cruelty," Adrian said. He felt the plane settle a shade, a lull that would last seconds at most. He used them. He stepped closer, inside the arc of Mason's reach, and Mason stabbed forward, a quick, snapping motion meant to shock and back Adrian off. Adrian turned with it, the needle scraping the sleeve of his blazer, and struck Mason's wrist with the flat of his hand. The needle clinked against an armrest, skittered, but Mason had anticipated the counter and wrenched his arm free, regaining distance. The breath of the cabin bunched at the back of Adrian's neck, hundreds of held exhales, hundreds of silent prayers. Somewhere to his left, a bottle rolled down the aisle with a lazy clatter before snagging on a seat leg. "Pilot can't help you," Mason said, smiling with no humor. "Turbulence keeps heroes seated." His chest rose and fell quickly, sweat shined along his hairline. The mask of service had fallen away, revealing the bone-deep grievance beneath. He cut a glance toward the galley where metal trays nested in a stack like silver shields. His free hand ghosted that way before he recentered on Adrian. "But I can keep this quiet." The phrase, a promise and a threat, needled into Adrian's thoughts, brushing against a cold intuition that what had happened moments ago would not be contained if he failed now. Images flickered, a press line, a headline, one sentence ripped out of context and sharpened into a spear. He pushed them aside. The present was a narrow bridge, lose balance, and the fall would be endless. "You will step away," Adrian said, measured and clear. "You will put the needle down. You will wait in the jump seat until we land." Mason's laugh rattled dry in his throat. "You still think you're in a meeting." He feinted high, then dipped the needle toward Adrian's ribs. Adrian pivoted and raised his forearm. Steel kissed cloth and slid, a shallow graze that burned. He answered with a short, driving shove that sent Mason stumbling a step into the aisle wall. A chorus of gasps. The needle flashed again, wild this time, and Adrian felt the sting of a nick along his wrist. Blood welled in a thin crescent, but his grip remained sure. He caught Mason's sleeve, dragged him a half-step closer, and spoke into the small space between them so only the two of them could hear. "Look at him," he said, nodding toward Victor and Elias without breaking eye contact. "That child is not noise. He is my son." For the first time, something flickered in Mason's expression that might have been doubt or might have been rage curdled into confusion. It lasted a heartbeat. He bared his teeth and yanked backward, tearing his sleeve from Adrian's hold. "Your son is not special," he said, voice scraping. "No one is." He lifted the needle higher, elbow tight to his ribs, the stance of a man training the point for a face. Adrian braced, seeing the trajectory, counting it down, 1, 2, then stepping off line. The thrust passed where his cheek had been. He caught Mason's forearm in both hands and slammed it to the padded headrest, the needle point digging safely into vinyl. The passenger in that seat flinched but held, eyes squeezed shut, hands gripping the armrests as if he could anchor the plane by will. "Stop," Adrian said, not as a plea, but as an order. Authority carried its own gravity when spoken without fear. He felt Mason's muscles coil and twist under his grip, an unspent violence searching for purchase. A tremor ran through the fuselage. Overhead doors rattled like teeth. The intercom crackled again and died, as if even the flight systems understood how narrow the margin had become. Adrian released the arm a fraction to avoid being pinned by the next lurch, and Mason slipped free with snake-quick economy, spinning out and slipping 2 rows back toward Victor. The shift was pure predation. Adrian launched after him, boots pounding the runner. "Victor!" he snapped, the single name a command. Victor turned his body at once to shield Elias, presenting his shoulder and back as a barrier, chin tucked over the baby's crown. Mason's hand slashed forward, not with the needle this time, but to grab, to wrench. He caught Victor's shirt and yanked, hauling him sideways into the seat arms. Elias wailed, a bright spark of fear in the sound. The sight punched the air from Adrian's lungs harder than the tray had. Father before strategist, he felt an old, uncomplicated anger ignite. He crashed into Mason from the side, driving him against the seat backs, forearm tight across the attendant's chest to pin the thrusting arm. The needle nicked the vinyl again and snapped free, falling to the carpet where it winked once like a dropped star. "Enough," Adrian growled, voice roughened by breath and fury. He felt Mason's chest heave beneath his forearm, heard the rasp of his breath. For one suspended second, the cabin unified. No phones raised, no whispers, only the held stillness of men weighing choices. Mason broke it with a snarl. He slammed his forehead forward, catching Adrian at the brow, an explosion of white behind Adrian's eyes, and twisted his hips to wriggle loose. The blow staggered Adrian an inch, and he surrendered it rather than cling and lose balance. He took a quick step back and reset, heels glancing the aisle runner's edge, hands open, palms forward. The needle lay between them like a pivot of fate. The plane trembled again. A service light above the galley popped and went dead, leaving the aisle in a softer, more dangerous half-light. "Rule is simple," Mason said, chest sawing. "Silence the thing that breaks the line." He rolled his shoulders, the civility of his uniform now a costume gone wrong, threads teased out at the seams. In that instant, Adrian saw, with the clarity of a businessman evaluating a failing company, that Mason's grievance was older than this flight. It was a story Mason had told himself for years about who deserved quiet and who did not, about who was entitled to space and who must be forced into smaller shapes. The realization did not humanize him, it made him more dangerous. A man with a story that justified harm could always find a reason to escalate. Adrian's mind catalogued the environment again, the stacked trays, the half-open galley drawer, the narrow geometry of the aisle, the bend of the bulkhead 2 rows forward where sightlines ended. He didn't need to win the war here. He needed to preserve the objective and create the conditions for the next move. He angled himself between Mason and Victor, a human door. "Walk away," he said, voice once more calm, almost quiet. The calm a warning more than a peace offering. "Walk away, and this ends with you still holding your job." Mason smiled, a small, chilling thing. "It ends when I say it ends." He dipped to snatch the needle again, and the motion was the match that found the dry thread of everything that had led them here. Mason's lingering stare, the cold water, the hissed judgments, the first taste of blood. Adrian moved to intercept, muscles firing, breath steady. In the reflection of the darkened service window, he caught a glimpse of himself, tie askew, brow marked, eyes steady, and a dim outline of Mason bending with him, two silhouettes converging on a single point of light. He understood, without fully knowing how, that the line they were about to cross would define what came next far beyond this aisle. He understood, too, that there are moments when patience is not virtue, but permission. The aisle narrowed to a funnel of air and noise, every sound bright and distant at once, the rattle of a loose latch, the whistle of conditioned air, Elias's soft sob hiccuping against Victor's shirt. Adrian reached for Mason's wrist, and Mason came up with the needle, and between them the balance tilted, not entirely by choice but by the mathematics of fear and resolve. Somewhere a bottle shifted again, tapping out a metronome's warning against metal. The plane steadied, then sighed into another gentle sway, as if the sky itself were holding breath with the passengers. Adrian met Mason's stare and saw that no words would turn him. The time for argument had burned away. What remained was a decision neither of them could walk back. When Adrian spoke, his voice was the same controlled instrument he used to sign contracts that changed the lives of thousands, and it cut through the hush cleanly enough for everyone to hear. The true fight had only just been stitched into fate. Victor's grip tightened around Elias as Mason lunged, fingers clawed and eyes feverish, the aisle suddenly too narrow for reason. "Give him to me," Mason snarled, his voice a harsh whisper over the engine's hum, the words trembling with a strange authority that made the nearest man in the row stiffen. Victor turned his shoulder, curling his body to shield the child, but Mason's hand cut across his face with a flat crack that sent him sprawling sideways into the armrest. Elias cried out, the sound high and thin, and Adrian felt something in his chest tear loose, fear turning into motion before thought could catch it. He hurled himself forward and met Mason's midsection with his shoulder, driving them both to the carpet as drink cups rattled and a metal fork skittered under a seat. They hit hard. Air blasted from Adrian's lungs and Mason's elbow hammered his ribs. The aisle compressed into flashes, shoe soles, lowered tray tables, trembling hands reaching, the thread of the plane's ceiling lights streaking past like lines on a ruler measuring chaos. "Stop! Stop this!" a man's voice shouted from a nearby row, but the plea broke on Mason's growl. Adrian's fists found purchase, the sharp jolt of knuckles against cheekbones stung his skin and sent a surge of heat up his forearm. Mason absorbed the blow without flinching, a grim smile pulling at his mouth as if pain merely sharpened his focus. He hooked Adrian behind the neck and wrenched him sideways, the world tilting as they rolled over discarded napkins and a crushed packet of crackers. "Hold him," another man called from the opposite aisle, but there was hesitation in his tone, the kind that comes when danger feels like a live wire and everyone is afraid to be the first to touch it. Mason twisted his torso with an odd, practiced efficiency, his hand snaking toward the seat pocket where the spool of medical thread had fallen. Adrian saw the glint of the curved needle as if it were a sliver of winter sunlight in a dark room. Mason's fingers closed around it. A breath later, the thread slid across Adrian's throat, faint as a whisper at first, then tightening with terrible intent. Air thinned. Adrian's vision narrowed. He heard his own heartbeat, 3 hard knocks inside his skull, then the muted throb of the engines returned like distant thunder. The thread bit deeper, a hot wire singing against his skin. Mason's forearm pressed across Adrian's shoulder, levering him into the carpet. "Be quiet," Mason hissed, breath sour with metal and coffee. "Be quiet, and everyone will be fine." The words were absurd and chilling at once, as if silence itself were the prize he had come here to claim. Adrian clawed at the thread and felt it give a fraction, enough to drag a breath that tasted of stale air and spilled soda. "Adrian!" Victor's voice cracked from somewhere above the seats. Adrian angled his chin, a small victory that kept the line of the thread from sealing completely. He thought, not in sentences but in flashes, of Elias's small hands, the delicate tremor in his son's lip, the dark shock in Victor's eyes when the slap landed. He tasted iron. He remembered boardrooms where men hid knives in questions and learned again the skill of reading intent under the surface of polite words. A cable of thought snapped into place. Fear makes people obey. Exposure makes them freeze. Resolve makes them move. He needed resolve. Tactics in a narrow aisle. He shifted his weight, not trying to throw Mason, just trying to unbalance him. The carpet's rough weave rasped at his cheek. A man, 2 rows back, leaned over and grabbed Mason's shoulder, but Mason shook him off with a violent shrug, the thread burning a new line at Adrian's neck. "Do not touch me," Mason said, the command flat, the tone disconcertingly calm. His eyes flicked to Elias only for a heartbeat, but long enough for Adrian to see it. That glance was not anger. It was doctrine, like rules written in the back of his skull. Adrian felt cold understanding bloom. This wasn't improvisation. This was a creed he had built somewhere quiet and let harden. Adrian tightened his abdominal muscles and kicked outward, his heel catching the base of a seat. The recoil slid them half a foot, enough to jar Mason's balance. The thread loosened, the space of a breath, and Adrian took it, gulping air that tasted like life. He grabbed Mason's wrist with both hands and shoved it up and away from his throat, the tendons under his fingers hard and shifting. Mason's face moved close, and Adrian saw the tiny cut from earlier, a bead of blood near the hairline, and the way Mason's pupils were wide as coins. "You don't lead anything," Mason murmured, the thread trembling between them. "Money does." "And money will be quiet now. Not today," Adrian said, and though the words came ragged, they carried weight. He drove his shoulder forward again, this time angling to tangle Mason's arm between the aisle and a lowered tray. The plastic hinge groaned. There was a muffled pop as the tray strained against its latch. Mason grunted, the sound small but honest, the first hint of effort that broke through his veneer of control. Adrian heard the soft click of a phone camera shutter, then another, and knew without turning that more men were recording, the way witnesses in a storm wait for proof that lightning struck. Dramatic irony rose like a tide. They wanted evidence. He needed action. The evidence could only protect them after he survived the next 30 seconds. "Give me his hands," a man shouted, closer now, and the fear in the cabin shifted. It was still there, static in the air, but it began to braid with courage. A broad palm pressed Mason's elbow to the aisle floor. Another hand hovered, unsure, then settled on Mason's other forearm. Mason flung his shoulder and slipped free with a snake-like twist, his fingers dancing the thread tighter once more, but the grip lacked the earlier certainty. Sweat ran along his temple. He breathed faster, and in the quickened rhythm Adrian sensed a crack in the dogma that had held Mason together. Elias's cry wavered, then steadied, a thin wail like a siren, cutting through the fog. Adrian let it anchor him, a metronome that set the pace of his next move. He released Mason's wrist with one hand, raised his elbow high, and chopped down across the forearm with a controlled strike that deadened the fingers. The needle slipped. The thread slackened. He tore it from his neck and flung it aside, the strand catching the light as it arced and landed across the aisle like a dropped snare. Mason's expression changed. Not rage, not fear, but a colder thing. Calculation. He raked his nails across the carpet and pushed up in a low crouch, weight balanced, gaze moving, seat back, armrest, Victor, Elias, Adrian, counting possibilities. Adrian rose with him, legs unsteady but planted. The cabin's noises returned in layers, the engine's steady thrum, the soft gasp of the man in the window seat, the clink of an ice cube rolling unseen underfoot. Adrian lifted a hand, open, palm outward, the gesture paradoxically calm. "It ends now," he said, voice low. "Step back." "You don't tell me when things end," Mason replied. The words came soft, almost conversational, but his shoulders rolled forward, drawing power into the next strike. He feinted left, then cut right, his hand darting toward Victor again. Adrian intercepted, forearm to forearm, the impact sending a shock through his elbow. He pivoted and drove Mason's back into the edge of a seat. The man in that seat, gray-haired, jaw-clenched, braced himself and did not move, his stillness a small act of bravery that gave Adrian a stable wall to work against. Mason hissed air through his teeth and tried to hook Adrian's knee. Adrian shifted weight, felt the attempt pass, and trapped Mason's ankle between his own. They locked there, breath against breath. "Look at him," Adrian said, not taking his eyes from Mason's. "Look at my son." "You think fear is order? You think quiet is safety? You've built a lie and you're trying to stuff us inside it." Mason's eyes flicked again, another fraction of a second to Elias, and in that glance Adrian heard the faintest echo of something like doubt, the hairline fracture in stone you only see when the light is right. The men nearby felt the change too. One of them, tall, face tense, edged into the aisle and set his hand on Adrian's shoulder, not to pull him back, but as if to anchor him. "We've got you," the man said, voice shaking but certain. Another man reached for Victor's arm, steadying the baby's weight. The plane's cabin, a moment ago a scatter of isolated fears, began to act like a single organism finding its balance in turbulence. Mason wrenched free with a barked breath and staggered a half step, shoes sliding on a crushed lemon slice. The thread lay near his heel. He glanced at it, and in that glance Adrian saw a plan rematerialize, the same ritual, the same loop. Number. Not again. He stepped forward, closing space, and struck 3 short, practiced movements. A palm heel to the sternum to take breath, a forearm sweep to clear the reaching hand, and a shoulder drive to pin Mason against the seatback's hard edge. The seat creaked. The man in it gripped the armrests and held firm. Mason's breath left him in a dull grunt, surprise widening his eyes. "Enough," Adrian said, voice flat, the word carrying like a gavel strike. He felt the raw sting at his throat, the damp heat of blood under his collar, the tremor in his forearms where adrenaline wore grooves in resolve. He would not escalate, he would not relent. He would hold the line, now, here, until order meant safety, not silence. The thought clarified like cool air after a storm. The difference between control and protection is who you're shielding. And he knew who he was shielding. Near the galley, the service cart clinked as the plane shuddered through a shallow pocket of air. A half-full bottle rolled, stopped against the lip, and waited there, a small omen that balance, once claimed, must be held. Adrian kept Mason pinned, pressure measured. "Stand down," he said, "or I will make you stand down." For the first time, Mason's gaze broke. He looked past Adrian to the men in the aisle, to Victor's set jaw, to the phone cameras held with both hands, the silent witnesses who would not rescue him from his choices. Mason swallowed, throat working. His hands flexed. Adrian felt the shift before it happened, the coil of another lunge rising in Mason's shoulders like a spring under strain. The decision came like a clean line through noise. If Mason moved for the child again, the fight would end decisively. Adrian's knees bent, center of gravity low, breath ready. Around them, the men held the space as if holding a door against wind. Mason's lips parted, shaping a word that never came. He feinted left again. Adrian did not bite. He followed the real movement, right hand darting for Victor, and cut it off at the wrist, turned the joint, and brought Mason down to one knee with controlled force. The cabin inhaled. The plane's nose angled a shade, beginning some distant descent the passengers could not yet feel. Adrian's mind noted the shift without letting go of the present moment. This would be decided here, in this narrow strip of carpet where fear had tried to write new rules. "Look at me," Adrian said, tightening just enough to stop the struggle without breaking anything he could not mend later. Mason looked. For the first time, something like understanding flickered in his expression, maybe recognition that he had met an equal will, maybe the first hint that consequences had arrived. It did not soften him, but it steadied him, as if some argument inside him had ended. They breathed there, facing each other over a line that could not be seen and could not be crossed. Beyond them, Elias's cries slowed, then hiccuped, then settled into small, shuddering breaths. Victor's shoulders eased, his eyes glass-bright with exhaustion and relief. The men in the aisle did not cheer. They did not move. They simply held the space, letting the moment settle on its own terms. Adrian felt the burn in his lungs, the pulse in his neck where the thread had bitten, the tremor beginning in his hands now that the storm's center had passed. He did not release Mason yet. He would not until he knew the next move would not be another lunge toward the child. He steadied himself on the seatback, eyes calm, voice steady as a judge announcing an order. "This fight is finished," he said. "Stand down." Mason's jaw worked, but he did not speak. The thread lay dark and thin on the carpet between them like a crude symbol of the line that had been drawn and defended. Somewhere up front, a chime sounded from the cockpit, a neutral tone that somehow felt like a distant bell signaling that what happened here would be remembered there. Adrian met Mason's gaze and let the silence do its work. In that silence, every man watching understood what the space had become. Not a corridor, not a passageway, but a place where choices carried weight, where harm met consequence, where a father refused to let fear define order. And as Adrian held the line, the thought formed in him with the surety of a verdict delivered. The aisle had become a courtroom, and Mason was about to be sentenced. He thought cruelty could be hidden mid-flight, but justice doesn't stay quiet. If you believe every act of abuse must be answered, hit subscribe. Justice starts here. With a desperate surge, Adrian drove his forehead into Mason's face. The impact cracked like a small thunderclap inside the narrow aisle, and the garrote of thread slipped from his throat. He fell back a half step, sucking air that burned his chest, a raw mix of recycled cabin oxygen and panic. Blood, his and Mason's, spotted the gray carpet and speckled the armrests. Victor, cheeks pale but jaw set, hugged Elias tighter and let two nearby men pull them backward toward the bulkhead, forming a shaky human shield with their bodies and raised forearms. The cabin lights hummed. Bottles rattled in the service cart. Somewhere, a chime pinged, routine and indifferent to terror. Mason staggered, touched the bridge of his nose, and smiled when his fingertips came away red. The smile wasn't relief. It was a message. He stepped forward with a tight, flexing posture, the spool of medical thread now nested in his palm, the line paying out like a thin wire. He looped it once, twice, and let it dangle, a cruel necklace waiting for a throat. "You lead men with money," he said, voice low and unsteady but certain in its edge. "I lead with fear." His gaze traveled past Adrian toward the small cries coming from Victor's arms. The baby's small hand opened and closed, a soft plea that only tightened the air between the rows. Adrian straightened, fighting the tremor in his arms. The plane felt smaller than before, seats like ribs, aisle like a windpipe. He saw the beverage cart to his right, capped bottles, a metal edge polished by thousands of flights, a napkin holder rattling on its rails. Numbers rose in his head the way they did in boardrooms. Weight, distance, leverage. He took one short step. Mason mirrored it, thread bobbing, grin fixed. A man in a blue blazer rose 2 rows back, hands splayed. "Stop," he said, but the word floated, thin and powerless. Another man near the window fumbled with his phone, the lens blinking like a witness waking up. Adrian's fingers closed around a heavy glass bottle. He didn't announce it. He didn't threaten. He lifted it and snapped it against the cart's corner. The crack rang down the cabin. Shards skittered across the cart. A jagged triangle remained in his grip, bright under the overheads. Gasps moved like a wave. Even Mason blinked, just once, just enough. Adrian lowered the shard to a defensive angle at his hip, not brandishing, simply aligning the geometry of survival with the narrowness of the aisle. His mind narrowed with it. Not a boardroom now. A corridor. A calculation that must finish before the next breath. Mason's smile thinned into a sneer. He twitched the thread, testing its draw like a fisherman checking line. He stepped left. Adrian mirrored, keeping the cart between them as a partial barrier. "Glass breaks," Mason murmured, rolling the spool across his knuckles. "But fear holds." His shoulders rose with a quiet breath, and in that tiny rise Adrian saw the cue, the coiled spring behind the words. Mason's eyes flashed to Victor and back. Adrian felt the intent leap like static. "Don't look at him," Adrian said, and the calm in his tone surprised even himself. He heard his own voice as a line thrown across water, straight, taut, unshivering. "You're looking at me." He shifted the shard to his other hand, testing balance. It fit awkwardly but fine, the edge clean and bright. The cabin air seemed to tilt, the engine's constant rumble settling into the bones. He catalogued what he had: a shard, a cart, 10 feet of aisle, 3 men ready to help but unsure how, and a baby's soft crying that rewired every choice he would make. Mason advanced, sudden and cat-like, snapping the thread forward. The filament flashed as it whipped toward Adrian's forearm. Adrian jerked back. The line kissed his sleeve and bit skin, a hot sting blooming seconds later. He didn't yield more than half a step. The cart wobbled. A bottle clinked. Mason tugged the line to test the cut, pleased with the crimson welling through fabric. "You feel that?" he asked, as if they were partners reviewing a demonstration. "It takes so little." "It takes a decision," Adrian answered. He lifted the shard higher, still not waving it, simply drawing a plane in the air that Mason would have to cross. The math of the cabin rearranged. If Mason lunged, the thread would snare, the shard would parry, the cart would pin, the armrest edges would become allies. He saw it like a diagram overlaid on metal and fabric. Behind Mason, a young man leaned into the aisle with his phone, eyes fierce, knuckles white. Another man, balding and broad-shouldered, crouched near the floor, ready to hook an ankle. They were signals in a network that Adrian, by instinct, began to coordinate. He spoke without looking away from Mason. "You, by the window, stay back but keep filming." The phone's owner nodded, breath hissing. You, in the blazer. If he moves for the child, grab his elbow, not his wrist. The man in the blazer stuck a thumb up, small and determined. Adrian wasn't giving orders to prove power. He was writing the plan in the air where panic had erased language. Even Mason, for a heartbeat, paused at the clarity. The thread twitched. Mason's body braced. Adrian exhaled, then cut his gaze, not his face, down and right, baiting a glance. Mason took it. In that flicker, Adrian slid the cart half a foot forward, the little motion creating a new angle. Mason reacted, stepping into the gap, the line rising. Adrian pivoted, blade hand leading. The thread snapped toward his neck. He caught it with the shard's spine, not the edge, and rolled his wrist. The line rasped over glass, singing a whispered note. Mason pulled, Adrian pulled back. For a tense second, they were connected by a cord neither could relinquish. The cartwheels squeaked. The engine hum swelled. "You don't want this," Adrian said softly, not as a plea but as a readout, truth spoken like a measurement. Mason's pupils were large, ravenous. He leaned, converting pull to rush, any pretension of restraint gone. Adrian stepped inside the draw, shoulder brushing the thread so it sliced fabric, not artery, and snapped his forearm up. The shard kissed Mason's fist, one clean tap that shocked his grip. The spool jumped from Mason's hand and clattered onto the cart, spinning like a coin. The loose filament fell in a soft silver loop on the carpet between their shoes. Mason didn't yelp. He laughed, short, breathless. "There he is," he said, blood thick in his throat. "Now finish it." He lowered his stance and lunged again, hands open, fingers crooked like hooks. Adrian saw the future branching. If he retreated, Mason would crash into Victor's flimsy wall of protection. If he committed, they would close distance and there would be no space for finesse. He heard Elias's cry, a small hiccuping sound that made time bend into a single duty. He advanced. Their shoulders collided. The shard scraped Mason's forearm, leaving a bright line that deepened, then ran. Mason hissed, grabbed for Adrian's wrist and found it. The shard wavered. The two men rocked against the cart, which rolled until a wheel snagged on a seat mount. The jolt nudged Adrian's balance. Mason drove his weight, trying to staple Adrian to the cart with raw mass. Adrian's ribs flared with pain. He shifted his hips, dropped his weight, and twisted, swapping positions so the cart trapped Mason at an angle. Muscle memory, learned at some forgotten self-defense seminar, returned like a chord remembered mid-song. "Let go," Adrian said through his teeth. Mason squeezed harder. The shard dug into its own wielder's skin until Adrian rotated his grip, aligning the edge away from himself. He pressed it to Mason's sleeve, not plunging, just showing the equation of edges and skin. Mason's breath gusted across Adrian's cheek, hot, metallic. "You won't," Mason whispered, not as taunt now, but as faith. "Men like you never do." Adrian's heartbeat steadied, oddly. He didn't see a villain. He saw a choice shaped like one. The world thinned to line and angle, to breathe and responsibility. He remembered the moment a contract hinged on a word, the way the room had waited. This was that moment with blood attached. He pushed the shard another millimeter, enough to slice fabric, not flesh, and felt the shift in Mason's confidence, surprise where certainty had been. The older man's face mottled, his eyes flickered to the fallen thread, to the cart's edge, to the men behind Adrian who now stood braced, silent pillars. "You think you hold fear," Adrian said, voice quiet as a closed door. "But fear doesn't hold a future." He tilted his head toward Victor without turning it. "Move further back," he said, and feet scuffed on carpet. Distance grew behind him like a safeguard built from inches. Mason's lips pulled back from his teeth in a grin too thin to be joy. He rolled his shoulder and chuckled, a sound that broke and reformed. Then, "End it," he said, the words scraped and eager. He let his head tilt, reckless and inviting. The thread on the floor glittered like a miniature runway light. The young man's phone lens trembled. The man in the blazer flexed his fingers over the top of a seat, waiting for a cue that might never come. Adrian's mind flashed, one image, unbidden. The curve of a needle, the fine bite of thread, the threat made minutes earlier to a mouth that only knew how to cry. He saw not punishment, but symmetry. He didn't move yet. The shard remained a breath from flesh. The cabin held its breath with him. He let the silence work, let it carve a shape in the moment that Mason could see. Mason looked into that silence and, finding no retreat, filled it with his last certainty. Laughter. He threw his head back and laughed again, louder, reckless, the sound bouncing off plastic and metal as if he were daring the plane to shake. "Do it," he said, and the syllables carried the same chill as a hatch opening at altitude. His laughter bled into a hard grin. He leaned forward the tiniest bit, a volunteer stepping toward his own dare. Adrian shifted his weight, not forward, not back, but into the balance point where action is inevitable. The shard's edge steadied in his hand. The thread glinted at his feet. The cart's corner pressed into Mason's ribs. He wasn't thinking of revenge. He was thinking of what it meant to make an ending that would also be a warning. He inhaled. He felt the aisle narrow into a decision as sure as a signature. Passengers watched with wide, unblinking eyes. The engine note rose a half tone. Somewhere, a call button chimed and then stopped. Adrian's jaw set. He lifted his gaze to Mason's, and for the first time the older man's pupils twitched, just a tremor, just enough to admit doubt. Adrian drew a line in the air with his words, clear and cold. "This ends with you seeing what you've done." Mason's grin faltered. Then it returned, thinner, and he whispered, "Make me." The shard rotated a hair's width. The space between them sealed into a last, inevitable shape. In Adrian's mind, the earlier threat echoed not as a taunt, but as a vow reshaped by duty, a vision of consequences the aggressor could not escape. The foreshadowing of sewing eyes shut forever whispered through Adrian's mind. The needle's fate was about to turn. Mason struck first, the suture needle flashing like a thin shard of lightning as he jabbed toward Adrian's chest. Adrian pivoted hard, the motion tight in the narrow aisle, and brought the jagged bottle shard across Mason's forearm in a controlled arc. The cut was shallow but enough to jolt the attendant. A line of red dotted the gray carpet and speckled the armrest. The cabin's hum swallowed the passenger's collective gasp. "Stay back," Adrian said, voice steady but low, the shard held in a guarded grip. His eyes never left Mason's. He saw not a uniformed attendant but a man burning with a private fire, one that had jumped the railings of reason. Mason staggered a step, then rallied with a ragged breath. He jammed his hand into the open first aid kit and came up with a roll of adhesive tape, yanking a length free with his teeth. "I'll seal every mouth that dares scream," he hissed, the words taut like wire. He slapped the tape against his own palm as if to test its bite, then snapped the roll back toward the rows, making some men flinch. The aisle lights washed his face into planes of shadow and pallor, and for a heartbeat the whole aircraft seemed suspended on the edge of a decision. Adrian advanced one step, then another. He kept the shard low, not waving it, letting its hard edge speak for him. "Put it down, Mason," he said, pacing his words to his breath. A man in the aisle seat, older, gray at the temples, raised a trembling hand as if to help, then thought better of it and lowered his gaze. 2 rows back, a teenage boy held a phone chest high, filming with a shaking grip. A thin man in a business suit pressed his shoulders into the window, his lips moving in a soundless prayer. Adrian felt all of it, the fear, the hope, the questions. He also felt the pull in his shoulders from earlier blows, the ache at his ribs, the need to end this before one more line was crossed. Mason curled his fingers around the tape like a cudgel and charged. The motion was sudden and ugly, a burst of speed in the tight corridor. Adrian sidestepped into an armrest, pain spurting along his hip, and parried with the shard. Glass kissed metal. The shard chipped. Mason's free hand snapped forward with the needle again, a stab meant for Adrian's shoulder. Adrian twisted, caught Mason's wrist with his left hand, and slammed it to the top of a seatback. The needle clattered away, skittering under the row. Mason snarled, a hard, breathless sound, and swung the tape roll at Adrian's head. Adrian ducked. The roll grazed his ear and thudded into the luggage bin with a hollow knock. "You think this ends with me?" Mason spat, panting through clenched teeth. His pupils looked blown wide, his breath too short. "It's order that keeps men safe. You let noise rule, chaos follows. You made chaos," Adrian said. The words landed like a verdict he hadn't planned but knew to be true. He could feel the weight of eyes across the cabin, waiting for a signal from either man. "This ends now." For a stretched instant, neither moved. The engines thrummed beneath their feet. A bell chimed somewhere forward. Adrian's mind ticked in measures. Protect, control, finish. He tracked Mason's stance the way he would a spreadsheet's silent pattern, where the weak columns hid, where pressure would fold the structure. The tape hand was Mason's power now. The forearm with the cut would tire first. And behind Mason, only a few rows separated them from the lavatory door, a boundary, a hinge the whole fight could swing on. Mason lunged again, this time trying to bull rush. He clipped Adrian's shoulder. They locked, chest to chest, both grunting with effort. The shard pressed against Mason's uniform without breaking skin, a warning more than a wound. Mason's breath was hot and sour. Adrian smelled metal, sweat, and the weary plastic of the cabin. He shifted his weight and pivoted, using the aisle's narrowness against the attendant, grinding forward in short, brutal steps. Men in the row pressed knees aside to make space. An aisle armrest bit Adrian's thigh. A magazine slid to the floor with a papery sigh. "Sir, please," a soft male voice murmured from somewhere behind them. The teenage boy whispered, "Keep filming," to himself, as though the words could steady his hands. The gray-templed man finally raised both palms and said, "Enough." It wasn't loud, but it carried. The sound seemed to draw a line that only one of them would cross. Mason whipped the tape roll up for a strike at Adrian's face. Adrian blocked with his forearm, adhesive slapped skin and pulled hair. He didn't flinch. Instead, he shoved Mason back, pressing their momentum forward. Row by row, the distance thinned. The blue lavatory light glowed ahead like a small, indifferent star. With each step, Adrian felt the dynamic shift, not from fear to dominance, but from chaos to narrow focus. The shard gleamed under the downlight, steady as a metronome. His voice stayed even. Back. Now. Mason's heel caught an aluminum footrail, and for a breath he wavered. He licked his lips and smiled without humor. "You lead with money," he said, voice raw. "I lead with fear." The tape peeled against his fingers as he tugged off another strip, stretching it until it snapped. The sound cracked the air and skittered along nerves. Men blinked. Someone coughed. Somewhere forward a chime sounded again, followed by the smooth, disembodied voice of a male crew member asking passengers to remain seated. No one moved. "Fear isn't leadership," Adrian replied. He kept Mason centered in his vision and let the rest blur. He could sense Victor to his left now, holding a small, warm shape tighter against his chest. Adrian did not let himself look. He measured the distance to the lavatory in heartbeats. 4 steps. 3. 2. Mason fainted low, then snapped the tape toward Adrian's eyes. Adhesive grazed eyelashes. Adrian blinked hard, swung the shard up but checked the cut, choosing restraint by inches. He caught Mason's elbow, spun, and bounced him against the lavatory door. The metal sang with the impact. For a heartbeat, the two men froze, breathing ragged, faces inches apart. Adrian saw the man beneath the uniform, a shake along the jaw, a flicker of doubt, a younger self that might once have wanted to do right. Then Mason shoved back, forehead striking Adrian's brow. Stars flared at the edges of Adrian's vision. He clenched his teeth and rode the pain, refusing to give ground. The teenage boy's whisper reached them like a wire pulled tight. "He's got him. He's got him." The gray-templed man folded his hands at his chest. A thin businessman rubbed at a stain spreading on his cuff. Dramatic irony lived in the space between what Adrian knew he must do and what these men would later say they saw. He thought with a clarity that surprised him, this must end in a way no one can mistake. Adrian slammed his free palm beside Mason's head, flattening him against the door. The shard hovered at Mason's collarbone, not cutting, a bright line where choice lived. "Open it," Adrian said, the command quiet and final. Mason's fingers twitched near the handle, tape stuck to his palm. He sneered first, then obeyed, jerking the latch down. The door clicked inward on the smallest of arcs, letting out recycled air and the faint antiseptic smell that clung to every aircraft's bones. "Inside," Adrian said. Mason's eyes darted past Adrian's shoulder, searching for an ally who would not come. He tried to twist away, but Adrian rode the motion and guided him through the gap, using the narrow frame to break Mason's leverage. The passengers nearest them seemed to inhale as one. Adrian felt the cabin tilt in their collective breath, a pressure change before weather turns. He did not look back. He used his shoulder to push the door wider and his forearm to control Mason's center of gravity. The shard never wavered. "Big man," Mason muttered, but it sounded smaller now, like a bluff called late. He stumbled over the threshold and hit the sink with a thud that rattled the metal. The mirror shook in its frame. The tap rattled. Adrian anchored one foot across the seam where aisle carpet met linoleum and pulled the door in close behind them, tightening the world to the size of a closet. For an instant before the latch clicked, sound from the cabin swelled, breaths, a muffled exclamation, the distant ring of a service bell, and then it thinned again, replaced by the tinny buzz of the lavatory's light. Adrian held Mason by the collar and measured his next breath. He knew what the men outside saw. A father with blood on his sleeve taking a predator into a room with no witnesses. He knew, too, what would be asked later by men in suits, by men with microphones, by men who wrote policy. He would have to account for every inch. He would have to show that each move had been the least terrible choice left on the table. But that was later. For now, there was only the present, small and absolute. Mason flexed his hands, the tape still tangled around his fingers, and showed his teeth in a hard, humorless grin. "You going to finish what you started?" he asked, voice husky with defiance and something like fear. Adrian's grip tightened a fraction. He felt the ache in his knuckles and the old discipline he lived by: plan, act, own, rise like a tide he could trust. His thoughts narrowed to one silent, simple decree: protect. Behind the thin door, the plane carried on, engine steady, a whole sky between here and the ground. Inside the lavatory, the future bent toward a hinge it had been circling since the first raised voice. He drew a breath, set his jaw, and pulled the door shut until the latch engaged with a soft, decisive snick. The cabin exhaled, but the true reckoning began behind the locked door. Mason slammed Adrian against the sink so hard the metal groaned, and the flickering light cut their faces into sharp, warring shapes. Water spat from a loosened faucet, peppering Adrian's cheek, but he shoved back with a growl of effort, catching Mason's wrist and wrenching it toward the polished steel of the mirror. The suture needle in Mason's fist trembled inches from his own eye, the curved tip flashing with each blink of the failing bulb. "Drop it," Adrian said, his voice low and level, though his breath came fast. Mason's jaw clenched, sinews stood out on his neck. "You don't give orders here," he hissed, forcing the needle back toward Adrian with a quick, cruel surge of strength. Adrian anchored his stance, heel braced against the narrow threshold, shoulder driving forward for leverage. The lavatory was too small to step away, too close to breathe. Every surface crowded them, turning the fight into a vicious puzzle of angles and pressure. He felt the cold rim of the sink biting his spine as Mason drove him backward, and for a heartbeat the needle wavered within a hand's breadth of his face. Images flashed, Elias's mouth trembling, the thin cut of red, the way the cabin had gasped as one. He tasted metal in his mouth and refused to swallow it. "You tried to stitch my son's voice shut," he said, fingers tightening around Mason's wrist until the bones shifted. "Now, it's your turn." Mason snarled and twisted, but Adrian pivoted with him, letting the momentum carry both of them sideways. The move slammed Mason's shoulder into the wall. The plastic panel creaked. Adrian stepped in, compressing space, his forearm pinning Mason's bicep, his other hand lifting the broken glass shard to the hollow at Mason's throat. The edge kissed skin, and Mason went very still, breath rasping. "You won't," Mason said, but the words lacked conviction. Sweat gathered at his hairline and slid, shining down his temple. Outside, the engine's hum teased at normalcy, a steady lullaby for passengers who could not see the tight room's shaking center. The contrast worked like a vice. The world out there was orderly. In here, the world had already tipped. Adrian pressed the shard just enough to signal consequence. He felt the shiver run through the man beneath his weight. "Open your hand," Adrian said. Mason's fingers twitched around the needle, then clamped. "No." He tried to bring his knee up, a desperate crack at Adrian's ribs, but there was not enough room. The motion only lifted him into the edge of the countertop, knocking the air from his lungs in a thin, shocked wheeze. Adrian rode the opening. He seized Mason's hand and forced it higher, turning the wrist so the needle's arc aimed back at the face that had glared at a crying child. Mason shrieked and bucked, forearms straining, tendons fluttering against Adrian's grip. "You think you can break me," he spat, but the words were chopped by panic. The lavatory light flickered again, a desperate insect trapped in glass, and for a strobe slice of time they were two statues, one with a shard, one with a needle, both held in a freeze frame of consequence. Then motion flooded back. Mason jerked sideways, slamming his head into Adrian's cheekbone. Sparks burst across Adrian's vision. He held on anyway, swallowed the burst of pain, and drove Mason's hand toward the mirror with a sharp, controlled thrust. The needle's tip hissed past Mason's eye, scraping the glass and leaving a bright, hair-thin arc. Mason howled, fear, not injury, and clawed at Adrian's sleeve. Adrian answered by planting his palm against the back of Mason's skull and shoving. The mirror met bone with a hard, ringing crack. A spiderweb blossomed from the point of impact. Mason sagged, stunned, and Adrian did not waste the gift. He hit the mirror again. This time it shattered, the pieces blowing forward like a cold, glittering breath. Shards pattered across the sink and floor, a rain of tiny knives. Mason blinked at the ruin, breath stuttering. Instinct drove him to retreat, but there was nowhere to go. The door pressed behind his spine, the sink hemmed his hips. "Listen to me," Adrian said, the shards steady at Mason's throat. "You will never put that needle near a child again." Mason's eyes flared, and with the spark came a last, bitter stab of defiance. "You think you walk out of here clean?" he said, voice cracking. "You think they'll thank you?" He forced a choked laugh, thin and shaky. "They never do." Adrian's jaw set, and what he felt was not triumph, only decision. This was not a debate, it was the end of a line that Mason had drawn when he opened the first aid kit with a calm face and a cruel plan. Adrian slid his gaze to the coil of medical thread spilling from Mason's pocket where he had jammed it in the scuffle. The white line trembled like a live thing with each panicked breath. "Pick it up," Adrian said. Mason stared, not understanding, until Adrian tightened the shard and repeated, "Pick it up." With jerky movements, Mason reached down and fumbled for the thread. The spool rolled over the broken glass and knocked a loose chip into the drain. Dramatic irony laced the air as thinly and tightly as the thread itself. The instrument, chosen to silence a child, now hovered on the edge of silencing a different kind of harm. Adrian had no interest in revenge for its own sake. He wanted certainty. He wanted a mark that would keep this man from hiding behind uniforms and narrow corridors. He wanted the danger announced to the world on sight. The light flickered again, and through the uneven glare he saw Mason's face stripped of arrogance and left with the raw, animal fear of a cornered man who understands nothing except the limits of his options. "Hold still," Adrian said, voice as soft as a warning. He took Mason's hand, turned it palm up, and guided the needle with precise, unshaking control. Mason thrashed, but Adrian's forearm locked him to the panel. The room shrank to the sound of two men breathing and the faraway thrum of engines. The first touch of metal to skin drew a strangled sound from Mason's throat. "Don't," Mason gasped, eyes rolling. "Please." His plea broke into a ragged cough. Outside the door, a muffled clatter suggested motion in the galley, but the handle did not turn. Rules and fear kept the hallway quiet. Adrian angled the needle toward the tender corner of the eyelid, not to blind, but to mark, to anchor a warning where it would never be missed. "You will remember this," he said, and there was no need to raise his voice. Authority replaced volume. He felt the tremor move through Mason's body, the way tension changed shape when a man realized a struggle would not change the outcome. "You will remember every time you look in a mirror, and you will stop," he pressed. The needle slid through the thin skin with a soft resistance, a breath-sized give, and Mason screamed, high, shocked, then muffled by his own terror as he bit down to stop the sound. The thread followed, a pale line pulled by steady fingers and purpose. The lavatory light steadied for the length of a slow inhale, as if acknowledging the calm inside Adrian even as Mason trembled. He made the stitch clean and swift, not savage. The violence had already been Mason's. This was a reversal, a turning of a tool back upon the hand that had chosen it. Mason panted, tears leaking down his cheeks. "Please," he said again, small now, the word barely more than air. "Please." Adrian tied the thread with a practiced motion, fingers remembering old lessons in control and exactness. His hands had built companies, signed contracts, steadied a child's head. Now they drew a narrow line of consequence that words had failed to draw. "Look at me," Adrian said. Mason tried, flinched, tried again. The single stitch tugged the eyelid into a permanent suggestion of closure, an emblem of what he had intended for another. Through the disarray, cracked mirror, glittering shards, the smell of antiseptic and fear, Adrian felt the decision settle. He lowered the shard from Mason's throat, not trusting, only concluding. Mason sagged against the sink, a shudder traveling the length of him, and for an instant Adrian saw not a monster, but a small, dangerous man who had wrapped his pride in a uniform and mistaken it for authority. Foreshadowing ghosted the edges of the moment. Cameras in the cabin, voices on the other side of this door, the plane beginning its slow turn toward a diversion. But those belonged to a future that had not yet opened. Here, in the narrow room and the wavering light, Adrian's choice had a single purpose: end the threat. He glanced at the ruined mirror and at the stitch he had made, then stepped back, the shard still in his hand, the needle now quiet between Mason's fingers. "It's over," Adrian said. The words were steady. They were also true. Mason lifted a trembling hand to his eye, stopped just short of touching, and let it hover there as if the stitch itself might bite. He tried to shape his mouth around anger and found only pain. The room hummed around them, electric ballast, pressured air, the endless machine song of flight, and for the first time since the door had slammed, the noise did not sound like a countdown. It sounded like distance. Adrian reached for the latch, then paused, his gaze returning to the slack face before him. There was no triumph in him, only a hard, necessary quiet. When he pulled the door, it stuck for a second against a chip of glass and then swung wide with a squeal. Cold air from the aisle touched the heat on his skin. He kept his shoulders square as he stepped out, suit torn, knuckles marked, eyes clear. Behind him, Mason slumped against the sink, breath hitching, the band of thread holding like a small pale bar across what he had used as a weapon. In the hall light, the stitch showed plainly, simple and undeniable, judgment made visible. And in that harsh brightness, the final truth of the moment settled like a seal. The eyes that once glared with hate would never look the same again. The lavatory door burst open and Adrian stepped out, suit torn at the shoulder, knuckles streaked with blood, breath steady in a way that felt earned rather than calm. Behind him, the cramped mirror was a web of cracks, and Mason slumped against the sink, eyelids crudely stitched in uneven loops that trembled each time he whimpered. The aisle shivered with the sudden hush that follows a shout. Trays rattled as the aircraft pitched, and a bottle rolled, clinking against a seat leg before stopping as if afraid to make any more noise. "Move," Adrian said, voice low but carrying, and passengers recoiled without arguing. He crossed the few steps to Victor, who was still half standing in the row with Elias cradled close, his jaw tense and his eyes wet from the shock. Elias gave one soft cry and then pressed his cheek to Adrian's collarbone as the man gathered him in, the baby's breaths warming the torn fabric. Adrian angled his body to make himself a wall, his forearm sheltering the small head, his mind counting, airway clear, bleeding stopped. Calm him. Calm me. Then assess the next strike. Around them, the cabin rearranged itself into clusters of fear and relief. A young man lowered his phone, hands shaking after recording, and tucked it to his chest as if it were something living that needed protection. An older man in the exit row muttered, "He saved the child," as if reminding himself that what he had seen could be named. Another passenger, pale and sweating, pointed at the lavatory. He's in there." His voice wilted into silence when Adrian's eyes cut to him with a look that said the danger had been seen and handled, but not forgotten. A chime detonated the silence. The captain's voice threaded through the speakers, even, practiced, and careful. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. We are declaring a medical and security situation and diverting to Ironcrest Field. Please remain seated." The words were calm, but the pause between medical and security was a seam that barely held. Adrian heard it. He knew how seams worked. Once pulled, they ran. Victor stepped in close, shoulder to shoulder with Adrian, keeping his own body between Elias and the aisle. "You all right?" he asked, soft and stunned, his breath tight like a man who had been holding it for too long. "I am," Adrian said. He shifted Elias higher and felt the baby's small hand clutch the torn lapel. "He needs a towel." "Warm water, if there is any." He could hear his own voice and was grateful it was level. Anger still rushed like heat under the skin, but a cooler current had taken the helm, assessment, order, the method he had used in boardrooms and now used here, in a pressurized tube with strangers and a single point of purpose: keep the child safe. One of the attendants, a junior man whose name badge had been flipped backward in the chaos, hovered 2 rows away, trembling. He had done nothing when the first aid kit came out. He did something now. I can get a cloth," he said, eyes darting past Adrian toward the open lavatory door as if it might bite. "Do it," Victor said, his tone stern, the voice of someone who had found a task and would not let it go. The attendant hurried toward the galley, shoulders hunched, bumping a seat back with his hip and murmuring apologies that no one acknowledged. Elias fussed again, a thin sound more like protest than pain. Adrian's jaw eased, and he pressed a slow kiss to the baby's hair. The faint copper smell of blood lingered. He pushed it away with the practical instruction he repeated in his head: dress the wound, keep him warm, keep him close. His left hand shook once and stilled against the child's back. He would let himself feel later. If there was a later that did not demand a different kind of fight. Someone near the rear started talking, quick and breathy. This will be everywhere, this. Phones rose, some already pointed at Adrian, some at the jagged door of the lavatory where Mason's ragged breaths scraped the tile. A man across the aisle said, "Turn those off." Not harsh, but with a quiet authority that made two devices drop at once. Another passenger whispered, "He's a hero," while a different voice answered, "Or he went too far." The plane held both verdicts without choosing. Adrian heard them and let the words pass like wind around a stone. He focused on the work. The junior attendant returned with a warm cloth that steamed faintly and a sealed bottle of water. "I couldn't find anything better," he said, eyes still avoiding the lavatory. He reached out, then pulled back, unsure if he was allowed to get close enough to help. Adrian eased the cloth to Elias's lip, testing its heat with his wrist before pressing. The baby startled, then settled, the pressure soothing more than it hurt. "Good," Adrian murmured, and though the word was for Elias, the attendant straightened like he had been praised. "Thank you," Adrian added to the man. Gratitude cost nothing and changed much. The attendant swallowed and nodded, hands finally steady. From the ceiling speakers, the captain spoke again. "Cabin crew, prepare for landing. Passengers, please fasten your seatbelts." Another chime. Another seam pulled. The junior attendant moved down the aisle, tugging at loose buckles with shaking fingers, pausing each time a hand grabbed his wrist and asked a question he could not answer. "We'll be on the ground soon," he repeated, and the rehearsed line gained weight by being true. Victor adjusted his stance, bracing against a small pocket of turbulence. "They'll want statements," he said, voice low. "You know that?" "I do," Adrian said. He kept his eyes on Elias, who blinked slow and heavy. He remembered the cold water Mason had smirked about, the needle that had drawn the first bright line of blood, the thread pulled like a dare. He pressed the cloth again, firm but gentle. "I told him he would regret it," he said, not to justify, not to boast, but because it was a fact that everything in him recognized as plain. Another rattling roll of the cart in the galley drew eyes. A man seated near it, broad-shouldered and quiet until now, stood halfway and slid the cart into a locking groove. "No more accidents," he said under his breath. It was a small, practical gesture that tightened the cabin's sense of order by one notch. The gesture echoed outward. Seat belts clicked. Bags were wedged more securely under seats. Breaths were counted and let out together. From the lavatory, Mason's voice rose once, hoarse and breaking. "You'll answer for this," he rasped, the words thinned by pain and by the ruin he had authored. The junior attendant flinched. Adrian did not look back. He would answer for what he had done, but not to the man who had tried to turn a child into silence. A man 2 rows forward twisted around. "Sir," he called to Adrian, careful and respectful, "I recorded everything from when he brought the kit. If you need it, I'll give it to you when we land." He lifted the phone an inch as if showing a pledge. Adrian met his eyes and inclined his head. "Keep it safe," he said. "Don't share it until you're asked." The man nodded, and his fingers tightened around the device like it was a baton he would not drop. Another voice, hushed but urgent, drifted from a small cluster near the wing. "There will be lawyers. The company will try to spin this." The observation hung like condensation, visible and cold. Adrian felt the truth of it the way he felt the engines hum through the floor. He had seen boardrooms turn wrong into acceptable with a memo and a meeting. He knew that stories, once untethered, could be made to say anything. The thought did not scare him. It sharpened him. The captain's announcement returned with a new edge. "We have begun our descent into Ironcrest Field. Please remain seated." The lights dimmed a notch and the forward bulkhead seemed suddenly closer. The pressure changed, a soft grip in the ears, and the cabin reacted with a ripple of swallowing and blinking. Adrian checked Elias again. The cloth had pinked but not soaked. The baby's breathing had evened. He slid his palm over the tiny back once more and felt the steady lift and fall answer him. Victor leaned in. "When we touch down, let me speak first if they rush you," he said, eyes steady as if asking for the chance to repay a debt he had not incurred but felt anyway. "You'll be next to us," Adrian said. "That's enough." He did not say, "Thank you again." The words would come later, when there was space for them to land. For now, he gave Victor the thing both men needed: purpose. "Help the others. Make sure that door stays closed." He angled his head toward the lavatory. Victor nodded once, expression firming into duty. He moved, not far, just enough to set himself as a barrier if necessary. The junior attendant hovered near, taking the cue, shoulders finally squaring like he belonged in his own uniform. The wheels and air spoke to each other beneath them with the first soft kiss of approach. Flaps whispered out. The aisle lights felt brighter, as if the plane had decided that more clarity was needed. Phones were lowered a notch, either out of obedience or because the moment had changed from spectacle to consequence. Adrian breathed and held his son in a shelter made of one arm and the last of his tempered strength. He let his focus narrow to what was in front of him: the weight of the child, the cloth, warm and now fading to lukewarm, the feel of the seat under his legs, reminding him he still occupied space that would have to be defended in more polite rooms. He did not let himself think about the badges waiting on the ground, the lights, the microphones. He did not think about the questions that would come with the words "how" and "why" sharpened to points. He thought about one thing only: that he had stopped a hand and that the hand would not rise again in this cabin. In the row behind, a man whispered to another, "There will be headlines." The other answered, "There will be sides." Neither used the word justice. The omission flickered like a warning light in Adrian's mind. He filed it with the captain's careful pauses and the junior attendant's backward badge. Threads. Every thread would be needed. The landing gear thumped into place. The plane gave the briefest shimmy, then steadied. Adrian felt the change before the captain spoke. He shifted his grip as if preparing to carry the next weight. Elias stirred and made a small sound that did not belong to fear anymore. It sounded like protest against sleep. Ordinary. Human. Alive. Adrian closed his eyes for half a second and let the sound fix itself inside him. Somewhere toward the front, a man's voice said to no one in particular, "Whatever they say, I know what I saw." It was simple and strong, and it threaded itself into Adrian's resolve like a knot that would not slip. The nose dipped. The runway rushed up, invisible but inevitable. Adrian opened his eyes and stared straight ahead, spine set, mind already drawing lines from this aisle to an office, to a courtroom, to a place where language would try to do what his hands had done. He would be ready. He would not let this be turned into a story that excused the needle or forgot the cry that started it all. He held his son, and the plane sank toward the lights. The fight in the sky had ended, but the war on the ground was about to begin. Sirens washed the tarmac in blue and red as the aircraft door yawned open to the night, and orders cut through the recycled air like blades. "Step forward, hands visible," a voice barked, firm but strained. Adrian stepped out first, shoulders squared, Elias pressed to his chest, the baby's soft breaths warming the fabric of Adrian's shirt. Wind stung his eyes. Camera shutters snapped from behind the barricade, each flash a judgment, each flash a question. Paramedics rushed past him, the stretcher wheels clattering. Mason, bandaged, rigid, eyes hidden beneath gauze, was rolled down the stairs. A murmur swelled from the waiting crowd, the kind that carries awe and suspicion at once. Adrian's grip tightened instinctively. He didn't resist when two officers approached, palms open to show caution, not cruelty. "Sir, we need you to hand the child to someone you trust," the taller officer said, voice measured, the kind trained to calm storms that never learned to quiet. Adrian found Victor's face in the wash of lights. The man stood near the entry, pale but steady. Their eyes met, an unspoken pact renewing. "Victor," Adrian called, voice low but certain. He pressed Elias into Victor's arms, fingertips lingering just long enough to feel his son's weight settle into a safer hold. Elias squirmed, then calmed at the familiar scent of the man who had held him during the worst minutes of the flight. The moment was small, but it anchored Adrian. He turned to the officers and lifted his hands. Cold metal circled his wrists with a click that felt louder than the sirens. On the apron, reporters called his name. "Mr. Cross, did you attack the flight attendant?" Why were his eyes bandaged? Was the baby harmed? Questions piled like snow, each one threatening to bury him before he could speak. Adrian kept his eyes forward. Silence was his shield now. Precision would be his sword later. The officers guided him to a waiting cruiser. He caught a reflection in the window, his face marked by fatigue, dried blood at his collar, eyes steady. Not a victim, not a villain. A father standing inside a storm. The station was colder than the night air. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, a sterile lullaby for men who had learned to sleep in noise. Adrian's cuffs were removed, and he was led into an interview room with walls the color of old paper and a table that had seen years of worry in the grooves where knuckles had pressed. The door clicked shut behind him. A camera's red dot glowed in the corner, a single watchful eye. Adrian sat, placing his hands flat on the table, the posture of a man who has chosen discipline when rage would be easier. Two detectives entered. The first, lean with a squared jaw, introduced himself as Sergeant Hale. The second, broader, with careful eyes, was Officer Marin. "We're recording," Hale said, nodding to the lens. "You're not under arrest at this moment. We're speaking for clarity and safety. You understand?" "I do," Adrian replied, his voice even. The metal chair creaked under him, a small sound in a room built to enlarge small sounds. Hale folded his arms. "We've taken statements. We have medical reports to come. Tell us what happened after the plane reached cruising altitude." Adrian described it, step by measured step. The request for warm water, the cold reply, the baby's crying, the first aid kit, the needle, the thread, the strike toward Elias's mouth. He kept his sentences clean, each one an anchor. His hands didn't shake, but his breath did at the memory of metal shining inches from his son's lip. He said, "If he can't cry, then no one will be disturbed." Adrian finished, the words leaving his mouth like stones he had been forced to carry. Marin exchanged a brief glance with Hale, then looked back at Adrian. "You're aware there are allegations you escalated, took actions that exceeded defense." Adrian didn't look away. "I defended my son. I defended other passengers. I did what I believed was necessary to stop an ongoing attack." Hale leaned forward, elbows on the table. "And the injuries to the attendant's eyes?" Adrian's jaw locked for a second, then released. He chose clarity. "In the lavatory, I restrained him with tools he introduced as weapons. I intended to end the threat. I did not intend permanent harm, but I intended a permanent stop to what he was doing." Silence held for a heartbeat. In the hallway, a phone rang and was answered quickly, the sound sealed again by the closed door. Marin uncapped a pen and tapped it. 1, 2, 3, then stopped. "Passengers recorded video," he said. "We are collecting it. We'll verify timestamps and continuity." He paused. "The co-attendants claim shock. They say they didn't understand what was happening. They say you overpowered a colleague. They watched," Adrian said softly. His voice carried a tired edge, the edge of a man who knows how organizations protect themselves. "They watched long enough for a child to bleed." The door opened and a uniformed officer slipped in a stack of labeled drives and a plastic evidence bag. Hale took it, brows nodding as he scanned the tags. Row 12 right, row 13 left, aisle, cam 2, passenger phone. "We'll review all of this," he said. His tone carried a faint change, curiosity turning toward resolve. "Mr. Cross, would you like counsel present before we proceed?" Before Adrian could answer, the door opened again. A man in a dark suit stepped in, removing leather gloves with patient precision. "He would," the newcomer said. His voice was calm, close to quiet, yet it filled the room. "Nolan Greaves, counsel." He set a slim briefcase on the table, nodded to the camera and offered a cordial glance to the detectives. "Sergeant," Officer Hale straightened. "Mr. Greaves, we're gathering facts." "As you should," Nolan replied, opening the case. He slid a folder toward Adrian, then placed a small recorder beside the official one. "My client will answer reasonable questions. He is fully cooperative. He is also the man who prevented further harm on that aircraft." He met Hale's eyes steadily, not challenging, not yielding. Hale folded his arms again. "We're not forming conclusions tonight." "Good," Nolan said. "Then let's avoid assumptions that lead to the wrong ones." Adrian watched the exchange with the stillness of a chess player about to move a knight in a crowded endgame. He breathed slowly. He needed his thoughts lined like files in a drawer, this fact, then this, then this. He needed discipline more than anger. He looked at the folder Nolan had placed on the table. Inside were names of passengers who had already volunteered statements, a preliminary timeline Nolan's investigator had started building from airport control logs, and a list of questions Nolan would advise him not to answer without context. Preparation, even here, was a kind of comfort. "Tell me about the first aid kit," Nolan said gently, pivoting the focus with a practiced ease. "Was its removal prompted by a request for help?" "No," Adrian said, eyes steady on the middle distance as he replayed the steps. He brought it unasked. He took out suture thread and a needle. He moved toward the child's lips. When I intervened, he resisted. Hale noted something. Marin leafed through a form. "We have a preliminary statement from a passenger named Victor Hale," Marin said, glancing up. "Not related to me," the sergeant added dryly. "He corroborates your account of the needle and thread." Nolan nodded once, not pleased, not triumphant, simply marking a tile on the floor as secure. "We will provide a full list of witnesses who saw intent and action. You will also find multiple clips show co-attendants hesitating when intervention was required." Hale's face tightened at the phrase. He looked at Marin. "We'll be asking the airline for their training protocols," he said as if thinking aloud. "We'll also want personnel records for the attendant." Nolan's gaze flicked to Adrian, then back to Hale. "That will be important," he said evenly. "Patterns matter. Patterns explain isolated storms." Dramatic irony draped the room like an invisible curtain. Adrian could feel it. Outside, cameras were already telling their version of the story, a version that would shrink an entire cabin sphere into a single image, bandaged eyes and a bloodied collar. Inside, the careful alignment of facts was assembling the truer picture, piece by piece. He felt the weight of both. He also felt a colder weight slide into place, the knowledge that even perfect facts can be bent by imperfect people. A knock at the door. The same uniformed officer returned with a new envelope. "Airport operations sent early extracts," he said. "Timeline of cockpit announcements, steward call signals, turbulence windows." Hale took it, brows rising slightly. "Thank you." The officer hesitated. "There's also media pressure," he added, unsure how to say it without saying it. "They're outside." "We're inside," Hale replied, simple and final. Marin pushed his chair back a few inches and looked at Adrian. "Mr. Cross, are you injured beyond what we see?" Adrian glanced at his wrist, the faint ring where the thread had tightened. "I'll live," he said. The words weren't stoic posturing. They were a quiet promise to himself. Nolan placed a hand flat on the table. "We'll need to arrange medical check for the child," he said, not a question, "and ensure chain of custody for all recordings. I also request that my client not be transferred until we've completed his statement with counsel present." Hale nodded. "Agreed." The questioning resumed, narrower this time, locations of nearby passengers, the angle of Mason's approach, whether any crew member attempted to intervene before the aisle struggle. Adrian answered what he could answer with certainty and withheld what memory could not guarantee. He refused to fill silence with guesses. His restraint had a rhythm to it, and Nolan matched it with soft corrections when a question edged into speculation or opinion disguised as fact. As minutes stretched, the tension shifted from raw heat to a focused hum. The room's small clock ticked above the door, marking a steady march toward a decision no one could yet see. Under the fluorescent hum, Adrian felt fatigue lean on him like a heavy coat. He straightened his back and would not slouch. His son's quiet breath against Victor's shoulder, he held that image like a talisman. Somewhere in the building, a printer came to life, spitting pages that would soon carry weight beyond their thinness. Hale gathered the drives again, arranging them as if lining up witnesses. "We'll break for 15 minutes, he said at last. "Then we'll take the official statement from the beginning, so the record is clean." When the door closed, Nolan exhaled and turned to Adrian. "You did well," he said softly. "Keep it steady. Let the evidence do what it is built to do." Adrian studied the grain of the tabletop, a map of pressure and time. "Perception is already moving faster than evidence," he murmured. His voice carried neither fear nor bravado, only truth. Nolan's expression didn't change, but his eyes sharpened. "Then we control what we can control," he replied. "We gather every second of video. We get medical confirmations. We prepare for the airline to protect itself." He paused. "And we stay ahead of the story without turning it into a spectacle." Footsteps passed in the corridor. A shadow crossed the frosted glass and moved on. Adrian felt for a moment a cold thread tug at the back of his mind, a warning that what they faced wasn't only a legal test but a contest of narratives trained to swallow men whole. He thought of the co-attendants, the delay before courage, the ease with which institutions write careful statements while sidestepping messy truths. If there was a pattern, it would emerge. If there was a wall, it would have a seam. Hale returned with a fresh notepad, Marin with a checked list. The camera's red light blinked, patient and relentless. Adrian settled his shoulders, lifted his chin, and fixed his gaze on the point where law, memory, and duty would intersect. He would not be the first to speak in the next round, but when he did, his words would land like stones building a foundation. Outside, the night pressed its face to the station windows, trying to listen. Inside, 3 men prepared to draw a line between noise and signal. Adrian knew, with the certainty of a father who'd stood between danger and his child, that the fight wasn't about anger anymore. It was about proof. It was about patterns. It was about the thin, stubborn cord that can hold when forces pull to tear it apart. He flexed his hands once, the muscles answering. When the recorder chimed to mark a new file, he met the lens and thought, as if speaking to an unseen jury already forming in the world beyond these walls, the thread of truth would either hold or unravel entirely. The first image on the courtroom screen froze the room, a trembling close-up of a curved suture needle glinting under cabin lights, inches from a child's mouth. No introductions, no preamble, just the incident, raw and undeniable. The prosecutor, Darren Pike, stood centered beneath it like a conductor before a dark symphony. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he said, voice measured and low, "this is what came before the violence you will be asked to excuse." He let the silence hang, then clicked to the next frame. Adrian's face in profile, jaw clenched, eyes wild with fear, his hands lunging to protect his son. The screen threw light over the paneled walls, over the judge's still figure, over the jurors leaning forward as if the whole bench had tilted toward the truth. Adrian held his breath. His palms were dry, his back straight. He did not flinch at the image of himself, though the weight of it pressed at his ribs. Pike turned from the screen to the jury, eyebrows lifted in a polite question he did not ask aloud. "We do not deny the threat," he said, pacing with slow, contained steps. "But remember this, when fear is met with rage, fear is not a defense for cruelty." His fingertip tapped the lectern. "Mister?" Cross crossed a line. He left the aisle and entered the lavatory with a broken bottle. He did not restrain. He punished. Each word landed like a metronome click. He raised a hand to the screen again, and a newer photo replaced the frame. The lavatory mirror shattered, light fractured into sharp stars. A murmur rippled through the gallery. Pike kept his gaze on the jury. He made a choice to do more than stop danger. He made a choice to leave a mark. He paused. The law forbids that choice. Adrian watched Pike's mouth form each careful syllable, watched the way he pivoted his heel so the jury saw his open palm and not his knuckles. A practiced performer, Adrian thought. He felt no hatred for the man, only the discipline to resist the story being rewritten around him. He glanced toward Nolan Greaves at counsel table. Nolan sat with hands folded, shoulders easy, eyes narrowed in concentration. He gave Adrian the smallest nod, a signal like a hand on a shoulder. "Hold steady." Judge Ransom's voice cut the hum of air vents. "Counsel, proceed with your witness." Pike called a cabin attendant named Irving Maris. Maris, a thin man with a careful haircut, moved like someone walking across ice. He sat, was sworn, and stared at his own hands while Pike asked about training, protocols, and what he saw in the aisle before the lavatory door closed. Maris's voice quivered at first, then steadied. "There was screaming," he said, "from the baby, from passengers. There was the needle. I saw Mr. Cross strike Mason, and I saw Mason strike back. And then Mr. Cross picked up glass." He swallowed. "Then they went into the lavatory." Pike nodded, sympathetic. "Did you see what happened inside?" "No." Maris's eyes lifted briefly. "I heard the mirror break." "Thank you," Pike said, softening his tone. "No further questions." Nolan rose. His movements were patient, nearly quiet. "Mister." Maris, he began, what is the first rule of crew response when a passenger is in danger? Maris blinked. Protect the passenger. Especially an infant? Nolan asked. Yes. And your colleague, Mason Dre, did he follow that rule? Maris hesitated. No. Nolan let the answer settle, then returned to his table. No further questions. He sat without show. Adrian sensed the jury mark the restraint. Nolan had left a space where drama could have been, and that absence felt like respect. Pike's next witness was a forensic specialist who, while fair, spoke of tissue damage with a clinical chill. He explained sutures, eyelids, pain. He said the words excessive force. He said intent. With each term, Adrian felt the scar on his son's lip flare like a memory under skin. He kept his eyes forward. He did not look back to where Victor Hale sat in the second row, hands clasped so tightly the knuckles blanched. When it was Nolan's turn, he stood and rolled the screen back to the aisle footage. I will not ask you to excuse violence, he told the jury, voice steady and plain. I will ask you to look at the truth minute by minute. He pointed to the timestamp. The first video played without sound. Mason crouching with the first aid kit, the glint of the needle, Adrian's sudden lunge, a baby's red, open mouth. The jury watched Mason press forward again after being shoved back. They watched him swing a metal tray. They watched the thread stretched between his hands. They watched fear become a room that held everyone. Then Nolan played the second recording, captured from 3 rows behind by a student with shaking hands. This one had sound. If he can't cry, came Mason's voice, cold and certain, then no one will be disturbed. A wave of discomfort moved through the spectators. One juror's lips parted. Another's fingers curled halfway into a fist, then loosened. Nolan let the sentence ring. Listen to the belief under the words, he said, that a child's voice is a problem, that a needle is a solution. He clicked pause and turned toward Adrian. Mr. Cross, he said, please take the stand. Adrian stood and walked the aisle between counsel table and witness stand like a crossing he had walked 1,000 times in boardrooms, except now every step felt recorded by the bones of the room. He was sworn in. He sat, spoke his name, and then folded his hands so the jury could see they were empty. Nolan did not ask him to relive the entire flight. He narrowed the questions to seconds and choices. What did you believe would happen if you failed to act? Nolan asked. Adrian's voice was quiet. I believed he would stitch my son's mouth shut. What did you intend when you entered the lavatory? To stop him, Adrian said, not to punish him. To end it completely, and when the mirror broke? I still intended to end it, Adrian said, and the effort not to tremble became a form of prayer. I wanted my son safe. I wanted everyone safe. Pike approached on Cross with the grace of someone setting a trap. Mr. Cross, he said, you are a decisive man, are you not? I try to be. Decisive men know they can choose to stop, yes? At any moment. I chose to stop the threat, Adrian replied. Pike placed a photograph on the projector, a still of Mason's bandaged face post-incident. Did you choose to stitch a man's eyelid? Adrian held the image with his eyes because avoiding it would look like weakness. I chose to make sure he could not hurt my son in that moment, he said. He had already pushed past people. He had already tried to stitch my baby's mouth. So you took sight from him, Pike pressed, voice cooled to a flat blade. I took control from him, Adrian said. Sight returns. He did not add that scars remain. He did not need to. The jury could supply that ending. Pike stepped back, satisfied with the sting, and said he had no further questions. Judge Ransom called the afternoon recess. The courtroom soon churned with whispers and careful glances. Adrian stepped down and returned to his seat. Nolan leaned close. Remember your breathing, he said, as if they were on a starting line. We are not done. The next witness was Victor Hale. He took the stand with the posture of a man who had carried weight too far and too long. He spoke of the needle by his cheek, the thread drawn tight between fingers, the smell of the airplane's recycled air when fear makes it metallic. I took the baby because Mr. Cross asked me to, Victor said. I held him, and I felt him shaking. I saw the needle touch his skin. He swallowed hard. I have never heard a sound like that cry. Pike tried to push him. Did, mister. Cross look angry when he passed you the child? He looked like a father, Victor said. That is not a feeling. That is a purpose. The jury wrote nothing down for a long time after that. Nolan then did something that seemed small at first. He asked the court to replay a sequence at half speed. On the screen, Mason's lips formed words that had been lost in the scramble of sound. You lead men with money, I lead with fear. The words slid into the courtroom with a cold weight. Nolan let them sit. And fear, he said softly to the jury, is not a right. By late afternoon, tension behaved like weather. Everyone felt it, and no one could stop it. The judge's clock ticked louder. Reporters shifted, pens poised. Pike sat with an air of quiet satisfaction, though a vein in his temple flickered. Nolan checked his watch, then the door. Adrian saw the change in his eyes. A calculation turned decision. Your Honor, Nolan said, rising. The defense moves to admit newly discovered evidence under the court's standing order on timely production. We received it moments ago and request a brief voir dire of the Foundation. Witness, Pike blinked. Objection, he said at once. We cannot try this case by ambush. No ambush, Nolan replied, palms open. A whistleblower came forward during recess. The material is limited, authenticated, and probative to state of mind and policy. Judge Ransom studied Nolan, then Pike, then the jury, weighing patience against fairness. Foundation first, he said. If you cannot lay it, it does not come in. Nolan called a man named Elias Morton, not a relative of the child, but a ground operations manager from Ardent Sky. Morton walked with the defensive posture of an employee who has learned to keep his head below the parapet. He confirmed his employment and the chain of custody of the email archive on a thumb drive. His hands shook as he swore that the messages had not been altered. Nolan projected the header of one email. Crew incident, MD, escalation plan. The date was from months before Flight 717. A flurry of whispers chased the letters as if the words themselves had motion. Pike stood, hearsay within hearsay. Business records exception, Nolan said, offered not for truth of passenger complaint but for notice to the company and pattern of response. The judge nodded. Overruled, subject to limiting instruction. He turned to the jury. You will consider these documents only for the purposes of notice, knowledge, and policy, not to decide whether the events described in them actually took place. Nolan clicked to the first email. It was from a supervisor named Randall Ketch to a regional manager. Subject line, Dre, temper. The message was short. We received another crew report about Mason D. Suggested coaching. Please no paper trail beyond this note. The room cooled. Nolan clicked to the next. Passenger complaint, infant disturbance, handled on board. A reply, remind MD to keep kit closed unless directed by lead. Another reply from higher up, we cannot afford incident optics this quarter. Keep cabin quiet. Handle internally, Adrian felt something tighten in his chest that was not relief and was not rage, but a recognition that the danger had never been singular. It had been allowed. He watched the jurors shift. 3 leaned back as if hit by wind. 1 leaned in, forearms pressed to thighs. 1 looked at Judge Ransom as if to ask permission to be angry. Pake moved quickly to dilute the spill. Mr. Morton, he said on cross, can you confirm that any formal discipline was imposed on Mr. Dre due to these emails? Morton hesitated. No, sir. So in fact, management responded with coaching. Correct? Morton nodded. And coaching is a valid response to many workplace issues, is it not? Yes. Pike smiled as if he had just unknotted a rope. No further questions. But the knot had tightened elsewhere. Nolan returned to the lectern. Mr. Morton, one more point, he said. Who wrote the phrase, we cannot afford incident optics this quarter? Morton looked ill. Regional Director Lyle Sen. Is Mr. Sen still employed? Yes. In a supervisory role over cabin crew? Yes. Nolan sat. No flourish, no speech. The words did the work. By the time Judge Ransom called for the day's adjournment, the courtroom felt like a lifted drawbridge. The gallery stirred into a low thunder of voices. Bailiffs moved forward with calm hands and practiced patience. The jurors stood in a slow line, eyes careful, steps measured. Pike gathered his files with crisp economy, but his jaw had set at a new angle. Nolan closed his binder and turned it sideways so the spine faced the jury box, an old habit that said, "No games, nothing hidden." Adrian remained seated for one extra breath. He did not turn to the cameras. He looked instead at the empty witness chair. He saw Victor's hands still clasped, knuckles pale. He saw Morton's uneven breath as he left, as if stepping out of shade into heat. Adrian flexed his fingers once, easing a cramp he had not noticed building in his palm. He did not feel vindicated. He felt precise. The shape of the fight had changed. He understood that the man in the lavatory had never stood alone. In the hall, reporters waited like a bank of lit windows, each one calling his name. Nolan touched Adrian's sleeve. "No statements," he murmured. "Not yet." Adrian agreed. He glanced toward a security guard who nodded once, a small human sign that order still existed somewhere. As they passed, a young man, one of the jurors, adjusted his tie with hands that shook. Adrian did not meet his eyes. He did not want to ask for anything from them except attention to the evidence. Back in the defense room, Nolan closed the door and let the quiet settle like dust. "Tomorrow," he said, "I will call one more witness on policy and return to intent. We keep the corridor narrow. Do not let them widen it to character." He looked at Adrian. "Are you ready?" "I have been ready since the aisle," Adrian said. His voice was calm. He felt the fatigue behind his eyes like a fog he would not allow to thicken. He thought of his son's small breath against his chest. He pictured a needle stopped by a hand. He let the image hold him steady. Outside, the courthouse clock chimed in the early evening, each note distinct. The case had taken on a second life beyond the walls, headlines, arguments, noisy certainty. But inside, the rhythm returned to the tick of the judge's clock and the rustle of paper. A pattern had been revealed. Not only a man, but a machine that had taught him he could act and be shielded. Tomorrow would bring closing arguments, the careful knitting of stories in front of 12 strangers who had seen too much to be easily led and not enough to be sure. The air carried the hush before a storm breaks, the kind that teaches a city how to listen. Adrian stood when Nolan stood. They left the room without speaking further, not because there was nothing to say, but because the words that mattered would be said in the morning where they belonged, under oath, under light, under the measure of law. He did not look back. The screen inside the courtroom had gone dark, but the images lived now in other rooms, other hands, other minds. As the door to the corridor opened, a final thought moved through him like a wire drawn straight. He had not asked to be a symbol, but he would not run from the work symbols require. He would hold to the minutes and the choices because that was all the law could weigh and all he could honestly offer. Somewhere beyond the courthouse walls, planes crossed evening skies, their windows catching the last light. The gavel would soon decide not just one man's fate, but an industry's shame. The defendant is found not guilty on all counts. The words fell into the hushed courtroom like a gavel before the gavel, a clean strike of air that made every shoulder lift and every breath pause. Adrian Cross did not move at first. He stood beside the defense table with his hands flat on the polished wood, knuckles pale, eyes fixed on the juror who had spoken. The foreman, a lean man with a careful voice, lowered the verdict form, and the murmurs began, soft at first, then rising in waves that lapped against the judge's command for order. Across the aisle, reporters jolted upright, pens scratching, cameras clicking like distant hail on glass. Nolan Greaves, Adrian's attorney, exhaled a controlled breath and set one steady palm on Adrian's shoulder, an anchor in a room that had just shifted its weight. "Mr. Cross," Nolan whispered without looking away from the bench, "do not react." "Not yet." His tone was calm, but his fingers trembled with relief, a sign only a close observer would catch. Adrian's gaze drifted to the jury box. The jurors did not meet his eyes. They stared at their hands, at the seal behind the judge, at the doorway through which they would vanish. He read gratitude in their turned faces, and also fatigue, as if any single look back might pull them into the storm they had just escaped. He swallowed, tasting the dry iron of tension he had lived with for weeks, and nodded once. When he finally allowed himself to breathe, the breath came as a quiet shudder, one he hid by straightening his tie and setting his shoulders. "Order," Judge Merrill said, the word a warning and a shield. He was a tall man with a worn robe and a voice that carried the weight of habit. He had guided the trial with a stern patience, cutting through noise the way a keel splits water. He adjusted his glasses and surveyed the room as it calmed. This court recognizes the verdict. We proceed to post-verdict matters. On the far side, an empty chair marked the place where the airline's lead counsel, Bernard Harlan, had sat through the trial with a fixed, dry smile. He stood now, the smile gone, a folder clutched to his chest. Behind him, representatives from Ardent Sky shifted in their seats, faces drawn tight. Near the back, 2 officers guarded the aisle where a stretcher had once rolled, carrying a man with his face wrapped in gauze. Mason Dre was not here today. His absence pressed on the room more than his presence ever had, a blank space outlined in memory. Adrian's mind tilted, not to Mason, but to Elias, the small weight he remembered from the plane, the warm breath against his collar, the sound that had turned the cabin into a battlefield. For a heartbeat, the courtroom blurred, replaced by the humming noise of the aircraft and the pale, shaking light above the lavatory door. He drew his focus back to the present, to the judge, to the second gavel strike that made the benches stop creaking as bodies settled. In consideration of the evidence presented, Judge Merrill continued, the court recognizes that the events on Flight 717, though violent and deeply troubling, arose from circumstances in which the defendant's actions were driven by immediate defense of an infant. This court further recognizes the disturbing internal record produced regarding Ardent Sky Airlines' prior knowledge of Mr. Dre's behavior and the failure to act upon multiple warnings. Harlan rose. Your Honor, we object to any language that implies liability. Sit down, Mr. Harlan, the judge said without heat but without invitation for debate. You will have an opportunity to file your motions, and I will read them. Today, the court addresses the exceptional nature of what was shown. Nolan did not smile. He stood very straight, a quiet man holding a quiet victory, eyes fixed on the bench. Adrian watched Harlan deflate into his seat, listened to the faint hum of the HVAC above the fluorescent lights, and realized how loud silence could be when it was earned. The order came next, measured, heavy, each word placed like a stone in a foundation. Ardent Sky Airlines is ordered to pay damages to Mr. Cross for the harms caused by its negligence in retaining Mr. Dre, Judge Merrill said, and to institute an independent review of crew conduct under the oversight of this court for a period of 18 months. He looked down at the file before him, then back at the room. You should have acted sooner. Because you did not, others were placed at risk. This is not punishment. This is not punishment for the sake of punishment. It is a structure to prevent repetition. The gallery stirred again. A reporter near the aisle whispered, "Write that down," to the man beside him. Another leaned forward and snapped a photo of Adrian's profile, catching the fixed jaw, the lined brow, the hint of weary brightness in his eyes. Nolan's hand left Adrian's shoulder. "It's done," he said softly. "Stand tall, then breathe." Adrian turned, and the room turned with him. He met the eyes of Victor Hale in the first row, the same man who had taken Elias into his arms on that flight. Victor rose halfway, palms pressed together in a motion that was not a clap and not a prayer, something between gratitude and restraint. "You kept him safe," Victor said under his breath when Adrian approached, voice shaking, words meant only for one man amid the crowd. "You did what I could not." "I was his father," Adrian replied, and the line landed like a promise spoken to himself. His voice did not break, though the memory scraped raw edges within him. He looked at Nolan again. "I would like to speak," he said. Nolan shook his head once. "Not here." "Outside. On our terms." But it began anyway, as inevitable as weather. The bailiff opened the side door and the hallway flooded with questions that rose like steam. "Mr. Cross, will you comment on the jury's decision? Do you regret what happened in the lavatory? Do you fear copycat confrontations on flights? Is this a message to airlines?" Their voices braided into a rope that tugged at him from every angle. Adrian paused at the threshold, and for a slender moment he felt again the thread against his throat, not in pressure but in idea, how easily a line can be used to control a story. He did not want his son's fear turned into spectacle. He did not want rage misread as glory. Nolan leaned close. "One sentence," he advised. "No more." Adrian nodded. He faced the cameras. "No parent should ever be forced to choose between following rules and protecting a child," he said, voice steady. "What happened in the air should never have been possible on the ground." He let the words stand without flourish, then moved on, ignoring the hands that reached, the microphones that angled nearer. Behind him, Harlan collected his papers slowly, as if the pace of his actions could rewrite the speed of the day. It could not. The hallway opened into the courthouse steps, and the afternoon light met them. Clear, cold, a brightness that showed every edge. Outside, a small crowd had gathered, held back by barricades. Some cheered as Adrian appeared, others watched in solemn quiet, as if trying to measure what justice looked like in daylight. He did not wave. He did not bow his head. He simply stood for a moment and felt the light on his face, the simple proof that a door had opened and he had stepped through. In the months that followed, the verdict did not disappear. It changed shape. Adrian returned to his office at Cadenza Systems and found that every corridor carried echoes, the respectful nods from engineers who had never spoken to him before, the careful questions from partners who wanted to know how he planned to leverage the public moment, the meeting agendas that slid in a new line for social impact. He recognized the risk in that. Success can harden into armor or soften into purpose. He chose purpose. He founded the Elias Foundation with the precision he would bring to a product launch, mission defined, metrics clear, guardrails firm. He sat with experts in child safety, transportation policy, and crisis response, men like Tariq Mansour, a logistics analyst with a calm mind and an exact memory for failures, and Lionel Beck, a retired captain who had seen policies crafted in conference rooms crumble in the cabin aisle. They debated how to make a difference without feeding a spectacle. "We need protocols that are simple," Tariq said during one early session, tapping a pen against a notepad in even beats. "Simple scales. Confusion is the enemy of safety." Lionel folded his hands and nodded. "And we need training that turns words into reflex. You cannot hand a manual to a storm." Adrian listened, asked questions, drew maps of cause and effect on whiteboards until his wrists ached. At night, he carried Elias down the hall after the boy fell asleep in the living room, felt the small heartbeat against his chest, and kept walking for a few extra minutes because there is a kind of healing in distance traveled while holding what matters. On his desk, late after midnight, he reviewed proposals for grants the Foundation could make, to fund research on de-escalation in confined spaces, to design a reporting line that bypassed corporate filters, to build tools that made it impossible for dangerous warnings to be buried in email folders. He crossed out anything that celebrated anger for its own sake. He underlined anything that rebuilt trust. News did not leave him alone. Profile pieces appeared with headlines that tried to simplify a complicated day. CEO Father or Sky Avenger. The verdict at 30,000 feet. He refused television interviews whose tone felt too eager for reenactments. When he spoke of systems, not of the mirror in the lavatory. "This is not a story about a hero," he said at one panel, choosing words like parts that must fit together. "This is a story about a gap. My son fell toward it. Someone tried to push him farther. We built a bridge." He looked down at his notes and added, softer, "Others will need that bridge." Adrian's company did not falter. It thrived, though he had expected turbulence. The trial had sharpened him. He cut meetings that wasted time, delegated with trust, and stopped believing that constant availability was the same as leadership. He met with his executive team and said, "We will measure performance by what we build and by how we build it." Neither carries meaning alone. The men around the table, Jared from operations, Colin from finance, Rafi from product, nodded, some with relief, some with curiosity. The changes took root because they were not slogans. They were choices repeated. There were nights, however, when the house quieted and the lines he had drawn between past and present thinned. He would stand in the kitchen with a glass of water and hear, in the hum of the refrigerator, a note of that old cabin light. The laugh returned then, brief, brittle, a shard from a moment made of shards. He did not welcome it, but he did not run from it either. He allowed himself to remember so that he would not forget why the Foundation existed, why the protocols mattered, why he had promised to use power for more than contracts. One evening, he visited a training session funded by the Foundation. In a mock cabin built inside a warehouse, actors reenacted difficult scenarios as instructors paused the scene and asked the participants, young attendants, serious-eyed supervisors, what they would do next. An instructor named Ethan Cole stopped the drill and addressed the room. "We are not here to imagine heroes," he said. "We are here to practice choices that keep us from needing one." Adrian stood in the shadowed back row, arms crossed, watching the men answer with halting honesty, Then, with growing certainty. He could see where this might lead, a steadier sky, a stronger ground. As he left, a maintenance worker named Jory stepped out from behind a stack of seats and cleared his throat. "Sir," he said, voice low, respectful. "My brother's a flight attendant. He showed me the videos from the trial. I'm sorry for what you went through. I'm glad you did not look away." The man's eyes held no heat, only sincerity. Adrian shook his hand. "I do not want anyone to live that again," Adrian replied. "Neither the passengers nor the crew." The handshake was brief, simple, enough. He drove home through a city that seemed quieter than usual, or perhaps it was only that he had learned to listen differently. At a red light, he looked to the sky, black now, dotted with slow, silent planes, and he felt the unevenness within him settle a little more. He knew there were others like Mason, men whose anger sought uniforms to make it look like order. He also knew there were men like Victor and Nolan and Tariq and Lionel and Ethan and Jory, hands steadying the edges where systems fray. The balance would never be perfect. But the work mattered. He unlocked his front door and found Elias asleep on the couch, a toy plane resting on his chest, the child's lips smooth, the old mark nearly gone. Adrian lifted the boy carefully, and as he carried him down the dark hallway, he felt again the weight that had guided each hard decision, a weight small enough to hold, great enough to change a life. In the quiet room, he laid Elias in his bed and stood for a long moment, listening to the even breath that answered the murmuring house. He did not think of victory. He thought of vigilance, of the choice to watch the places where harm might begin and to close them before anyone fell. He turned out the light and walked back down the hall, aware that tomorrow would bring meetings, calls, questions. He could face them. He would face them. The laugh that haunted him dimmed, not erased, but held at a distance by purpose. Power had once meant schedules and signatures. Now it meant something steadier, the daily act of building guardrails that no one would ever see, so that the worst moments would never arrive. He paused at the doorway, looked out at the night beyond the window, and felt the resolve settle into him like a thread pulled tight across a seam, invisible, holding. He remembered the courtroom, the bench, the order, the reason given in measured words. He remembered the plane, the aisle, the bottle, the mirror. He remembered the promise he had made, first to himself, then to the world that insisted on looking. And he spoke softly into the empty room, a statement to time as much as to the day behind him. Sometimes, the threads meant to silence end up sewing a louder truth. Seconds later, the father struck back. The same thread was used to end the attendant's power forever. If you stand for protecting the innocent and demanding accountability, subscribe now. Together, we rise. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores themes of racism, cruelty, and violent retaliation against unchecked authority. Its purpose is to raise awareness about systemic injustice, provoke reflection on accountability in positions of power, and inspire action toward justice, dignity, and reform.